The Thinking Tackle podcast.
Yeah, you have to wait for the right light levels and everything like that.
Or you take a top off and go, sorry, Simon, could you just put that jumper back on again? Because in the sequence of you hooking the fish, you had to jump. Anyway.
Yeah, it's completely artificial, isn't it? Simon?
Yes.
Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well. Looking forward to this, actually.
Good. Well, thank you very much for having me. I feel very honoured to be in this hallowed studio.
Looks all right, doesn't it?
It looks very smart. And I'm following in some very big footsteps. Mr. Fairbrass, Darryl Peck, I've heard of him. Some very serious anglers.
You're just as
some of my heroes are sat here, so I'm under great pressure to perform.
I'm sure you will. Okay, at the start of the show, we always ask for a gift, first of all, Simon. And I think, you've kind of covered all bases here with your gift, haven't you, for this show?
Yeah, so my gift, Simon, is a set of pharyngeal teeth from a 35-pounder that died in the Cotswolds a good few years ago. So the pharyngeal teeth, let me just explain what they are. Cyprinids, all the members of the cyprinid family, it's a very large family of fish, which includes the carp that we love and fish for, but it also includes roach, bream, tench, as well as lots of tropical fish like golden barbs, cherry barbs. So some really small fish that are only maybe 2 or 3 centimetres. All the members of that family, from 2 centimetres to 200 pounds, they all have pharyngeal teeth. And pharyngeal teeth, another name for them, an easier name if you like, would be throat teeth. So the throat teeth of a carp, this set that I've got in my hands here, they're on a bony structure, like a C-shaped bony structure, which is the final arch of the gills. And within that bony section, you've got a set of teeth. And the teeth themselves are very much like our human molars on a carp, but they vary from different species. So, for example, a chub has got really spiky pharyngeal teeth. Carp's pharyngeal teeth are actually quite, as I just said, like molars, and they crush up against a plate in the roof of the mouth. And that enables the carp, once it's drawn the food into its mouth, selected it and sorted out the debris from the food, it can then crush the food items, for example snails, and that facilitates much better digestion. So if the fish just swallowed the snails whole, the digestive enzymes in the gut wouldn't be able to get into that shell. So the pharyngeal teeth play an important role. They crush the food up and they enable the fish to get more nutrient value out of its food.
That's a great gift. And you were saying it's
a great gift for a carp fanatic, but if you're I
had to give its life for the podcast.
Yeah.
But you were saying as well that they kind of move their heads backwards and forwards
exactly.
to actually churn their food up.
Yeah, so anybody that's kept a carp in an aquarium, you can see this. And actually, if you're really feeling geeky, and you turn the pump noise off, and you put a crunchy pellet in, so for example a floating pellet, if you turn all the noise off in the room, you can hear the pharyngeal teeth, and they make a little clicking noise like that as they're crunching up the food, and you can actually genuinely hear that. It would be like if I gave you a packet of hula hoops and said, Simon, eat these really noisily, and you crunched them up, crunch, crunch, crunch. You're getting the carpy equivalent of that. And that's significant from a fishing point of view, I think, perhaps. But maybe we'll get onto that later. But so that's what the carp's doing. And if you watch closely, when carp are chewing their food up, anybody that's been stalking will see this. You can see a subtle flexion behind the head of the fish, and that's the fish working the pharyngeal teeth up against the masticatory plate. So it's chewing its food at that point.
Interesting. And you said with tench and other smaller fish, they love a tiger net, and they love to eat these baits, but they haven't got the capacity to be able to do the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. So the pharyngeal teeth from a big carp, they're a powerful organ. They're there designed to crush up big snail shells as well as other food items, and of course they can easily deal with tiger nuts. So they'll smash them up into small pieces, just the same as if I gave you a packet full of tiger nuts and said, chew these up. They'd produce something very similar to that. Now, if you're a tench, there's no question in my mind, having tank tested them, that tench love tiger nuts. If you that lovely syrupy slop that you get when you boil up your tiger nuts, carp love that, but tench love it too. But if you actually introduce that smell to a tank of tench, they get really turned on. If you actually give them the nuts to eat, they'll pick them straight up off the bottom and try and chew them. 45 minutes later, they're still trying, and eventually they just spit them out and give them up. And it's interesting that, having tank tested some carp as well, 4 to 5 pound carp find tiger nuts very, very interesting, and they obviously smell lovely to them, but they'll chew them and chew them and chew them and chew them, and they just make no inroads into it. So there's obviously the pharyngeal teeth of the fish need to be a certain size to deal with a tiger nut, and that's why they're such a good selective bait. So I think, tench probably in their early years suck up tiger nuts, think these smell nice, try eating them, and then give up, and then from then on they've learnt through that behaviour that you can't. It might smell nice, but there's no payback.
So they all like them, that they can't all eat them, which is like you say, makes a great bait. Simon, you've brought a few other bits and pieces with us with you as well, haven't you?
I have. Yeah,
got a right selection here.
Let's look at this.
Thanks for the gift, by the way.
Thank you. Shall I slide that over out the way? I'll put that over here on the side of the table. This is a carp skull. This is a 35 pounder. This is what the teeth came out of, so that gives you an idea. So for those guys that are listening at home that can't see this, if you can imagine a 35 pounder on the bank, it's just the head section.
Can I get you to hold that up a little higher so everyone can see it?
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, look at that.
How's that too?
So this fish actually died. An otter took it, and the top of its mouth is gone. So it's the top of the protrusible mouth has been torn clean off this fish, but that's as I found it. Obviously I fished the pharyngeal teeth out of it, but it does show beautifully the structure of the mouth and the eye sockets. And the bottom jaw is still in situ.
It's a hell of a structure, that.
Yeah, and if we turn it upside down and face it like that, so you can see into the skull. You can see the sort of internal workings. Gives you an idea of scale as well. So when a fish this size picks up a boilie, it's going to travel approximately 6 inches back to get to the pharyngeal teeth. So these pharyngeal teeth would be sitting in here. So you can see the distance from the mouth to those teeth is about 6 inches. It's quite a long way back. And between the lips and the pharyngeal teeth is a really fascinating organ called the palatine organ. And that sits in the roof of the mouth up here. And the palatine organ is like a sort of jellyish structure. If you look into the throat of a live carp and shine a torch down into its mouth, you can see it in the roof of the mouth, and it's got a pinkish colour in amongst the white of the mouth. And the palatine organ is a big, very, very taste-sensitive organ. And what it does is the food is drawn back under the palatine organ. The palatine organ traps the food against the branchial sieve, the structure in the gills. And you get these like finger-like projections that bubble up on the surface of the palatine organ, and they actually trap the food, like a little finger trapping the food against the branchial sieve, and then the fish can then backwash the debris, the waste, out. And often you'll see fish spit the debris out and then chew a bit as well. So the whole structure is really, really, there's a lot going on. There's millions of years of evolution to make this thing extremely efficient at feeding.
I've heard you talk before about fish picking up bloodworm and being able to, so they have to kind of filter the bloodworm through thousands of other.
Yeah, so I think an example I've used, and I certainly would have used it when I was teaching at Sparsholt, is if I gave you a pint glass full of silt, but buried beneath that silt in that pint glass were bloodworm, and said, right, in your mouth, Simon, I'd like you to take a big old slurp on that, like it looked a bit like Guinness perhaps, but it would taste disgusting. But in amongst that pint of silt, there are bloodworm. You've got to get them out in your mouth. You'd be going, yeah, and then you might actually go, oh, I've got one. Yeah. I've got a bloodworm. But the carp can do that in seconds. So that they're feeding in the sediment. As this carp, the skull here, as he pushed his head into the debris, sucked up a nice big slurp of silt with bloodworm in it. Within a few seconds that would be processed in the mouth, and according to the scientific research, that they only swallow about sort of 3 or 4% of the unwanted material. All the rest is actually washed away from the food in the head structure. So
that they're very efficient. So you've got very, very like fine tolerances of being able to siphon out food, but you've also got, it's quite mechanical the way their teeth work as well. It's there's a lot of stuff going on there.
Suction at the front, drawing the food in, the protrusible mouth. Then you've got the sorting organ, the palatine organ in the roof of the mouth, and then once the fish is committed, right, that is food, it gets passed back to the pharyngeal teeth. And that, it's a fascinating structure. When people say to me, oh, how do they know it's a rig? Well, when you look at the workings of this mechanism, you think, well, is there any surprise? Particularly if they're picking up bait off a really clean area of lake bed, then anything that act slightly out of the ordinary must seem very strange when it's in the mouth to them.
We were talking about long hairs and stuff like that before. We always used to get, well, probably before my time, but that we remember bite-offs that anglers used to be getting back then. Have you got any kind of...
Not bite-offs, but I've certainly used 3-inch hairs and caught plenty of fish. But when you look at that skull and the distance on say, this fish was it's a long way.
Yeah.
And on a 20-pounder, it's still about 5 inches. So that's a long way for the food item to travel back. To get a bite off, that fish has then got to chew that up, sat there on the spot. If it moves at all, unless you've got a really, really long hook link, presumably you're going to get some sort of indication. So yeah, I mean, things have moved on, but long hairs definitely, you can see how when you look at that skull they do work. You
can see that. Actually, getting back to the teeth as well, you said that you've discovered that carp lose their teeth.
I do, yeah. So where I've kept pet carp over a long time, I think I had my first pet carp when I was about 12. I found cleaning out filters and cleaning out garden ponds that in fact carp drop the individual teeth off the pharyngeal set. So when you look in a book, I'm picking up this pharyngeal teeth to show you now, Simon. This is the bone, you can see the teeth in the top, but these individual teeth are sometimes shed. Now, I met a gentleman called Alwyn Wheeler, fascinating man. He was like the person to speak to if you wanted to identify a British freshwater fish. He's no longer with us now, but I had the pleasure of sitting with him in an Institute of Fishery Management conference dinner. And during the dinner, I plucked up enough courage. I was only a young guy at the point. And I said, Owen, can I ask you a question? And I had a little pot with me of pharyngeal individual teeth that I'd collected from my garden pond. And he said, of course you can, Simon. What's the question? I said, well, obviously, to identify a carp, you need to know its pharyngeal, the dental arrangement, because that's what is specific to that species. And he said, yes. And I said, well, I think they lose their pharyngeal teeth, the individual teeth. And he said, I don't have any recollection of that. And I pulled out this little film canister pot and went, these are the teeth from my garden pond. And he was fascinated. We had a really good conversation about it. And subsequently, I've now got several pots of teeth at home from various garden ponds. And I've cleaned out filters for other people's fish and I found the same. You find a couple of pharyngeal teeth. I would say they're as rare as hen's teeth. Though,
yeah.
Because in a lake environment, of course, if they drop them, they just fall to the bottom.
Disappear forever.
They disappear forever and just become part of the sediment. But in a garden pond with a liner, and if you have a look round the bottom in the corners, they're quite dense. They, like our teeth, they would sit on the bottom. They're quite bright white initially before the algae starts to grow on them. You can find them, and it's just fascinating little insight into their life. So. I used to think perhaps my garden pond fish were specifically a Gumby set of carp with no teeth. About a bit like this, but I think probably that's just part and parcel of normal carp life, and they do lose their teeth. It may be, to put a fishing spin on it, it may be why some older carp become maybe more catchable or have a preference for softer or smaller baits, because if you're becoming a very elderly carp and perhaps you've lost a few of your pharyngeal teeth, then your ability to chew up perhaps tiger nuts or deal with a bigger boilie would be severely compromised. So possibly they then would have a preference for bloodworm or sweet corn or worms, maggots, those softer artificial baits that possibly need a little less chewing up.
Yeah, we said before that so they can survive without teeth, but they're going to find it a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, I think they could pick up bloodworm and certainly they could swallow bloodworm. And bloodworm require very little chewing. Obviously, a snail shell requires being smashed up to get the most out of the nutrient content within the snail itself. I remember catching a fish from a gravel pit near Yateley one day, and while I was dealing with the fish, it passed from its vent some really large sections of swan mussel shell. And I thought, when I saw them, my eyes watered. I thought, my word, ow. Anyway, I did the photos, I slipped the fish back, and afterwards I put the shell together, and it was a swan mussel shell of probably 10 centimetres long, so not an adult swan mussel by any stretch, but a reasonable sized animal, that fish had clearly sucked it up and then swallowed the shell down whole and chewed the whole thing. It had chewed up, so it came out in bits, but it swallowed, presumably because the way that the shell was attached to the swan mussel within it just swallowed the whole lot, and that had gone through the whole fish's system. And it passed it on the unhooking mat, and I was able to put the shell together and go, a whole swan mussel shell.
Well, I mean, they've got a hell of a digestive system because they haven't got stomachs, so they have to be able to digest everything pretty efficiently.
Yeah, so obviously, I've said they only swallow 2, 3, 4, 5% of the debris that they pick up, but within that there are going to be sharp bits of stone, gravel, sand, sticks, bits of leaf litter and stuff, and that's passing through them all the time. So they're well designed, not like us humans, comes out of a fridge and, oh God, it's got a bit of scrub. I can't eat that, some dirt on it. Put it in the bin. It's got a hair on it. I can't eat that. The carp is eating all sorts of debris along with its food and having to deal with it. So yeah, they're well designed.
Fascinating, aren't they? What else have we got there then, Simon?
Well, we've got a swan mussel shell. So this is a big swan mussel shell. This is a freshwater swan mussel shell. It's half of it, so it's a bivalve. It's got another half. This lives in the sediment. And and we know that without doubt carp do eat these. Not possibly when they're this size. This one, to give you an idea, it sits pretty big across the palm of my hand. It's a big one. That would be difficult for a carp to eat unless it was an enormous fish, maybe a French fish. But yeah, fascinating animals. I did a drain down on a lake in France. It was a 100-acre lake, a villadon, which is now a fishery, I believe. And when we did the vindage and took all the water out, we took all the carp out, it was fascinating to see that you couldn't find a single swan mussel anywhere in the lake. Absolutely none of them, apart from in the dam wall. And in the dam wall, there were hundreds, but they were actually wedged in amongst the stones where they were out of reach. So the population of carp there obviously had completely eaten the whole population of swan mussels, but they couldn't get to the swan mussels in the wall. You
fished Coatwater Country Park.
I have, yeah.
A lot of the anglers, when I first started fishing there, they would say you would cast out and pull back across the rocks. When they drained the lake down, they weren't rocks, they were those.
Yeah.
Thousands of them.
One of our production ponds at VS Fisheries has a lot of these in, and you can see exactly how you would pull across that and think you'd hear this sort of ding, ding, ding as it was coming back across the rocks.
Hit the gravel spots or the rocks.
Yeah, if you landed on one of these.
But there's so many of those and so rich in protein and stuff.
Yeah, it's a good food source, but obviously in the UK for a £20 carp, the period in which these guys would be on the menu effectively is quite small for a carp because obviously they can only eat them in their juvenile stages. There's a bit of a spin on this story that you might not be aware of, but their larvae are planktivorous. And they actually attach to the gills of fish quite commonly, not to feed on, but just as a place to live. So while the carp are swimming around in their environment, they are actually carrying the juvenile swan mussel larvae around in their gills. And in some situations, I remember doing a project when I was a student. We were looking at what had caused the mortality at a salmon farm, and it was a fry unit, so a freshwater fry unit. And the reason for the mortality was actually the larvae of swan mussels attaching to the juvenile salmon's gill tissue. And salmon, being very sensitive animals, when they're very young, they're very, very sensitive. That was actually causing a mass mortality of the fry. Obviously, in a water like Coatwater, where you've got big carp swimming around, then the larvae just adhere to the gill tissue of the fish. They live their life there for a while, and they can feed there because the food is constantly being flushed through with the water as it passes through the gill structure. And they live there for a few weeks, and then they detach and drop to the bottom to go on to become adult swan mussels. So the carp eat them at one stage and they carry them around at another stage.
And then right,
it's quite interesting little twist.
It is. Let's just break things up a little bit. I'm going to ask you to sign this before I forget, Simon.
Right, okay.
This is the 2019-20 embryo calendar cover.
Right.
I want to get all our guests to sign this.
Got to remember to spell my name right.
If you could just Toby, you've got to sign this as well, haven't you?
I'm going to sign it before my dad does. Imagine how well that would go
at this
down.
rate.
There we go, sir. All signed.
That's great. Thanks very much, and thanks for that stuff. It's always interesting. So I was going to say to you about your. We might come back to some of this stuff later. Your own fishing. I know, obviously, you've got a busy working life. How essential is it for you to still get out and fish regularly?
It is essential. My wife could definitely map a sort of degrading of my mood with longevity between trips. But yeah, I like to try and get as much fishing as I can. Realistically, this year has been particularly difficult because I've moved house. And loads of people obviously move house all the time. It's interesting if you look at the the list of things that can really affect human well-being, moving house is really high up there. It's on the level with sort of imprisonment, death in the family, and serious criminal convictions. So those are sort of things very stressful. It's interesting. Having moved house, I can see how you could actually cause death in the family by murdering your partner, and then end up with long imprisonment. But yeah, it's a stressful time. So unfortunately, during the back end of this summer, I haven't fished much. And then this autumn, again, just doing bits and pieces in the new home has meant that I haven't fished as much as I'd like to. During the winter months, when we're harvesting at the fish farm, realistically, I don't get very much time. I get maybe a night or two a month if I'm lucky. It's a bit weather dependent. Not so much at the moment. I did manage a bit last winter, but during the spring and summer, I like to try and get out, at least a night or two every week if I can string it together.
Right. So work fits quite well around, the best seasons of the year to go fishing then?
Yeah, I quite like winter carp fishing, I have to say.
Do you?
Yeah, my experience of, I think probably my most successful periods of fishing have come in the winter always. If I look back over the last, I can only remember 20 years of fishing, but it's a few more than that, maybe 37, 38 years of carp fishing. I think within that period, my most successful hits have come normally in really cold sort of December, January periods. So yeah, I do like winter fishing. But
is that just because you put more time into it, or?
I just think it's a bit more to the carp biology side. I think a carp which is evolved to live in water that's 27 degrees centigrade is fundamentally a really, really smart creature when the water's warm. When the water's cold, they lose that. And it's if you do your background work right and you do your homework right with the baiting up and you bait correctly through the winter, you are fundamentally fishing for a lesser creature, and its senses are reduced. Its ability to be aware of danger is significantly reduced. Its brain processing, all the chemical, everything that's going on in the whole body is effectively turned down to the lowest volume possible. If you put it in a sort of volume 0 to 10, where 10 would be full of steam, full beans, that's the summer. In the winter, you're on volume 0.5. Carp, in my experience, and I see it so much at the farm, in December, January, February, they are lethargic. They're clumsy creatures, and you can see. So if you're brave enough to get out there and you can find where they are and bait correctly, in my experience, that is the time to catch them.
Have you got go-tos for winter carp fishing generally that you regarding bait and location, that type of thing?
No, one of the things I would always is never ever ignore the shallows in the winter, but generally deeper water. But if you get the right weather, they love to get back. They want. As I've just alluded to, carp like to be 27 degrees centigrade. That is their optimum temperature. They've evolved over millions of years to work at 27 degrees centigrade. If you go, and interestingly, small carp can deal with better in warmer water, so above 27. But for an adult carp, 27 degrees centigrade is the biological optimum. That means that the enzymes within the fish's body are working at their absolute best. So for a carp in the UK, our climate, even with climate warming as it is, our climate is quite rare to get 27 degrees for any protracted periods. So for a carp, it wants to eat a nice big pile of food, and then it wants to sit in warm water as close to 27 degrees centigrade as it possibly can, because at that temperature, that is the temperature which makes its body work the best to get all the nutrients out of that food. So that's why you'll often see fish feeding in one area and then migrating to a different part of the lake, maybe to sit in the warmest water to digest their food.
So in winter you find that, I mean, we think that they're going to be dormant for a long periods of time, but actually when they feed, they will move into shallower areas of water. Yeah,
they certainly feed. I've written about before, there's some lovely German research that shows that the area that a carp move in the winter is reduced. So they're sort of, if you like, the range within the lake is reduced, but they still move about. And on the farm, you see this beautifully. Like, we've had some really cold weather in the last 10 days, and the lads at the farm fed the fish on Tuesday of this week. And when I said to the lads on Wednesday, do you see much sign of fish yesterday when you fed round? Yes. Despite the cold, frost on the ground, some of the big fish ponds with upper doubles, 20 pounders, there was definitely signs of feeding activity. So those fish are feeding even though it's really cold. So, you know, it's they get in a routine. And certainly in my experience of a good few years of carp fishing, if you climb trees, particularly on small waters where you can see lots, if you climb trees on really little lakes and look down into that water, you'll see carp moving about in January and February. They just don't eat as much. So it's just learning the spots where they're going to feed, maybe educating them with the right baits, and being there, because I think they're fundamentally they're quite a clumsy creature in the winter. So I'd always say to people,
take advantage of that.
Yeah, don't not go fishing in the winter.
Yeah.
Go fishing, and even if it's, I've written about this in the past. You know, if you've got a bit of time over Christmas holiday, get fishing, even if you go for 2 or 3 hours at dusk, because as I've alluded, they're creatures of habit. Because of that dormancy and their lethargy, they become much easier targets for parasites. So fish leeches, for example, will often hop on a sleepy carp. Now, in August, that would be a really difficult target because the fish would flank or suck and blow water in and out of its mouth and knock the parasite off. But in January, it's not as active, so the leeches will get on the fish and they irritate the fish, and through the course of 24 hours that fish is likely to get up and go and have a little rub or maybe top on the surface. And in my experience of winter fishing, they get in these little routines, and if you were there at the right time, whether it's 2 a.m. or at dusk, and you see that, you'll see them show, they give themselves away. You put baits in those areas, you're on for you could become a winter hero, to coin a phrase.
It does feel a lot better. I was going to say as well, because we've been through a bit of a cold snap recently. So the transition period between, you know, a really cold snap and a warm, will they switch on straight away, or does it sometimes take a few days?
That's a great question. So water it's slow to warm up and slow to cool down. So it's very easy in the spring when you get a bit of sunshine on your back, you think, oh, I'll be feeding today. But the water could still be very, very cold. So water holds the temperature quite well, and it slowly heats up or slowly cools down. So the first frosty night or two, you know, obviously the temperature's coming down, but don't think that's it. It's frosty. They're not going to feed because the water is still going to be warmer than the air. And the same when you get a big, you know, low pressure system coming in the winter, and we've had cold like we've just had, and now it's windy. The race, I think, is often to get the right swim. Yeah. Rather than catch the fish, you want to make sure you're in the right swim on the lake. So you maybe need to get there a day or two in front of the fish. But yeah, it's not an instant switch. It takes 24 hours, 40 hours. But the reason that question is so good is because it depends on the lake. Now, it's often written in the past that a shallow lake is a better winter venue because if you get some low pressure, it warms up much, much quicker than a lake that's 25 foot deep. A deep lake often it fishes better into the autumn because it takes longer to cool down. So that cooling process is much, much slower. So if you're fishing a really deep lake, then you may well get autumn bites that just run on into December time before the sport dries up. And once it's got really cold and the fish is shut down, then it's tricky. If you're fishing a really shallow lake, you might have a couple of weeks in October when they don't really feed, and then it might pick up again if we get some mild weather in December or January. So, you know, it's worth looking at the lake you're fishing and thinking about that. Yeah,
I found with that those low pressure fronts in the winter, it tends to be the bigger exposed lakes that kind of hit the end of those southerly winds tend to fish better. Is that something that you found?
Yeah, well, that's a good observation, Simon, because the wind. The wind is obviously causing a rippling on the surface. It's stretching the surface of the water. So if you take your 20-acre gravel pit and then you put a big low-pressure system across it and a big wind, that 20 acres could become 30 acres of surface. So you're getting actually a lot of temperature. There's a lot of more surface area for the temperature to change through. So the water is exposed to the air over a bigger area, so it warms up quicker. And obviously then you're going to get a the as well. So the wind is moving water across the surface of the lake, which is then mixing at the downwind. It's turning it over, so you're getting this huge, great like conveyor belt of water going along the surface one way and then back along the bottom of the lake the other way. So you get, with a bigger lake, you get more mixing. So yeah, that a bigger, shallower lake is going to respond much quicker than a really deep, small lake. If you have a 2-acre lake that's 20 foot deep, it's going to take a long time for the temperature to get up. Rise further down.
Do they react to that the same way they would necessarily react to running water coming into a lake?
They love running water.
They do, don't they?
Yeah, carp are incredibly inquisitive creatures. And you see that at the farm a lot. I sit in my garden pond a lot. Wherever you deal with carp, that they are curious things. They come and check you out. I remember as a young guy when I was down in the West Country fishing, having a pair of waders on with my great mate Ben Gratwick, and we waded out to this tiny little island, and I remember being gobsmacked as this 20-pounder just came straight over to us, as if to say, "Hi guys, what are you doing in my house?" Like, you shouldn't be here. Have you not read the rules? No wading on this lake, please, guys. And but it came right up to us. It swam round us. It was curious to see what we were doing. It was having a look. So
just pure curiosity.
Yeah, I think they're curious creatures. They'd like to see what's going on. And that running water, any fresh water that's coming in, is obviously of big interest to them.
Does that last for very long, or do they get bored?
I think, the novelty wears off, definitely. And you can, if you've got a stream coming into your lake, you can rejuvenate that interest, if you like, by wading about. I've fished a lake in the past where there was a little stream coming in, and I found a great tactic if sport was slow or the fish were a bit lethargic, was to get in the stream and have a good old kick about and rummage about and stir a bit of sediment up. And again, you're releasing new smells up into the
famous Dave Lane Conningbrook story, wasn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, they're very, very curious. And I've where water's been running into lakes, particularly where it's not a constant, where water's been pumped into a lake, for example, in a gravel pit situation, if it's been pumped from the pit next door and a pump's been off for a couple of weeks and then it clicks on and suddenly you're sat beside the Ganges pouring into the lake and you think, oh my God, what's happening here? Fish love it. They come and investigate that.
They can't
and they can hear it. They've got a great sense of hearing. I touched on the pharyngeal teeth with that noise, that clicking now. That noise travels a very long way underwater, and there's no question in my mind that carp communicate a bit with that noises, as well as smells, which possibly we'll get onto later. But where that running water's crashing into the pond, they can hear that from miles and miles away, and literally miles, the other end of the lake, sort of thing, and they just come and have a look. Ooh, what's going on over there? Let's go and check it out.
It's interesting, that communication thing. So they communicate through noise, and
I think they communicate on lots of levels. There's certainly a smell thing. They can smell each other very well. The sense of smell in a carp, research has shown, is incredibly well developed. They're using the olfactory rosette. If I held up this carp skull just to show you where that is, Simon. So I'm looking at an area just in front of the eye socket on this fish, for those of you that are listening. So I'm holding the skull up, and just in front of the eye, there's a little depression in the skull. And if this fish had skin on its head, we'd have a little pit there, and that's called the nares, or the nostril of the fish. And within the nares, there's this little folded structure called the olfactory rosette, and that's designed to pick up very, very small levels of smells or scents in the water. And as the fish is swimming along, the little tiny flap of skin that sits above the nares forces water into the olfactory rosette, across the olfactory rosette, and then back out again. So as the fish is travelling around its environment, it's picking up scents. Now, we all know, those of us that catch fish, I don't very often, but as a carp farmer, I juggle a lot, so I know the carp smell well. You will know them through your fishing, and certainly your previous guests catch an absolute bucket load of carp. We all know that they have a certain smell to them, and they smell different to roach, they smell different to pike, they smell different to Welsh catfish. I'm a strong believer that carp, as they're swimming through their environment, can smell where other carp have been. So, for example, little corridors in the weed, they follow those. They're not just randomly swimming around going, I wonder where my friends are sitting in this weed bed. They swim, and anybody that's climbed trees, put on a pair of good quality Polaroids and look down into the water and watch fish will see that they follow very, very particular routes. And the next fish will follow exactly the same route, and then another one, and then another one, and they'll all end up sat together in the same patch. That's just not random motion. That's not just, I'll swim around and hopefully bump into somebody. And I think that they know which routes to take because the previous carp are leaving a scent trail behind them.
How much more sensitive is their smell than ours then? Because, I mean, we can stick our nostrils into a tutti frutti flavour bottle and think, wow, that smells. But how much better is it?
It's designed to be different to us. We're breathing in fresh air, so our sense of smell is a bit different. It's quite difficult for us to comprehend how a carp smells and tastes, because obviously we live our lives with our own sense of smell and taste, and so a carp's is different. They smell differently as well. They're smelling different things to us, but the chemical cues for the sense of smell of very, very minute levels. So some amino acids, we're talking a teaspoon in a swimming pool size sense of smell, so very acute. So for example, a bed of bloodworm is giving off amino acids, free amino acids up into the water above it. Now those bloodworm, just by their living, they're giving off a scent. And as a carp is swimming along, our carp can smell their position. So they can do their very best to hide by burying down in the silt. But unfortunately, there is no hiding. So as that carp is cruising along, he can smell areas of the bed that will smell more interesting to him. Now, that's all well and good. Now, if you're a carp, you need to suss out if that area of bloodworm is really ready to be hit or rich or ripe. I've heard people say that bloodworm beds are ripe. Now, the carp don't do that by their sense of smell. They do that with their sense of taste, which is fascinating. So what our carp will then do, it would cruise over an area, it would be picking up the scent of those bloodworm. It would then probe the silt with its mouth. So it's using its protrusible mouth. It's pushing that into the debris on the bottom of the lake. It's drawing sediment up into its protrusible mouth. At the same time, the barbels, which are effectively, there are 4 of them on the carp's mouth, 2 on the underside of the mouth, 2 large barbels, and 2 on the top side of the mouth, 2 smaller barbels. Those are effectively like our tongues. So you imagine swimming into your local chip shop and putting your tongue out on the counter and having a good old poke about. That's what the fish is doing. So it's sampling the density of bloodworm in the sediment in that area. Now, going back to the sort of research, but carp will swim around their environment and they will probe the silt as they go. They can smell the bloodworm. They know where the bloodworm beds are, and they'll probe the individual bloodworm beds, and then through something that the researchers would call optimal foraging, they will then feed on the densest patch of bloodworm. It's not random motion. They don't just go, that one smells good today. They know exactly where they're going because they've evolved to be that effective in their environment. If they weren't, they would never grow. So they go back to Cote Water. How big is Cote Water?
55 acres.
55 acres. So in 55 acres there, those carp living in that lake, let's say how many fish are in the lake?
About 100 carp.
So there's 100 carp living in 50 acres. They give or take. I haven't been there for a few years.
Don't quote me on that.
No quote me on these figures. But there's 100 odd carp living in that lake. They're swimming around their environment. They will know where the richest sources of bloodworm are. They'll also know where the richest sources of snails are, shrimps, which are agamrus, acellus. They'll know where the people's bait is, and they will be looking at those areas, effectively sampling those areas as they travel round, so they know when the prime feeding periods come within the 24-hour clock, they're in the right place at the right time to maximise their feeding efficiency.
Can I just get back to the bloodworm? You said they predominantly feed on bloodworm at night.
Yeah, they do, yeah.
I mean, so could there be a lull in the fishing for us in the middle of the night when they're feeding on bloodworm?
I might flip that on its head and say no. Often, that's the time you catch them because those fish, if they're living in a lake where bloodworm is the predominant food source, bloodworm, because of their diurnal rhythm, which is the rhythm of their life through the day and night, bloodworm are interesting little characters. They're called bloodworm because they're bright red, and the redness in them is caused by hemoglobin, the same as that we have in our veins that makes our blood red. So if you're a bloodworm, you know that you've got actually eat me tattooed on your forehead. That's a bad situation. So what you try to do to avoid being eaten by a carp or a tench or a bream or a roach is you bury into the silt. Now, the downside of that is there's very little oxygen in silt. And the deeper you go in the silt, less oxygen. So what your game, if you're a bloodworm, to do, the game of survival, is to pitch yourself as high in the silt as you need to, or deep in the silt as you need to be to get oxygen and survive being eaten. Now, a big carp can probe maybe 4 to 6 inches into the silt, so it can go down a long way. And carp will know, because they probe the bottom, as I've alluded to, as they're swimming around, they will know when those bloodworm are at their easiest to catch. Now, if you're a bloodworm living in the sediment, the bad news for you is that oxygen levels in a lake change between day and night. And in the daytime, because the algae and plants are photosynthesizing, they're producing oxygen. The oxygen content of the lake goes up. So if you're a bloodworm, you can wriggle a bit deeper, which makes you harder to catch. Unfortunately, at 2 o'clock in the morning, oxygen levels in the lake are low, and the little bloodworm's thinking, oh no, I'm going to have to take a gamble. I'm going to suffocate if I stay where I am. So they actually move higher in the silt. The upshot is, of course, the carp know through experience that the time to get those bloodworm caught is when the oxygen's at its lowest, and often I find bloodworm feeding fish feed at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Coincide.
Yeah. And of course then when you're fishing, those fish are conditioned to feeding at that time of the day.
I remember watching, it might have been Mark Bryant, they were doing, they were filming on Hardwick.
Right.
And they casted a PVA bag, I might be wrong with the Mark reference here, but they casted a PVA bag into the lake, and when they put a diver down there the next day, it was buried. You couldn't find it. And it scared the life out of anglers to know that.
That's brilliant, because as far as I'm concerned, the fewer people that fish in the silt, the better.
So don't worry necessarily about your rigs being buried in the silt.
I would worry about my rig being buried deeply in the silt, but I don't worry about fishing in the silt. And one thing you see very quickly as a carp farmer, and if you keep pet fish in the garden, you see very quickly that carp have no issue with pushing their head 4 inches into sediment to feed. That is they will feed all day long. Bloodworm are silt living creatures. Cyprinids, a big number of the family of cyprinid fish have evolved specifically to eat bloodworm. They're a very calorific food source. So actually, they're apparently more calorific than double cream. So bloodworm is, if you can find a rich source of bloodworm, it's good to eat. It's good food. So they've evolved to feed in silt. So as anglers, we tend to find those hard spots. I want to find a patch of gravel. A lot of the carp's food live in the silt. The game, I guess, as an angler, is to make sure that if you're fishing in the silt, you're presenting well. Now, funnily enough, I did some lovely stuff with Tom Rossiter just this week. He came to the farm, and we took some different lead setups and we dropped them into silt. We did a lead clip and a heli-safe system. It was fascinating because the lead clip went plug straight in. There was no water in the lake. It was a drained lake, but we went out into the sediment, waded out in my dry suit, and I crouched down in the mud and chuckled to myself as young Tom Roster is wallowing like a hippo out of his depth in the sediment. And I dropped this lead, and it just plugged, the lead clip plugged straight in, and the hook link stuck straight up out the sediment.
Right. Interesting.
The worst possible situation you could have. Did the same thing with the heli-safe. This is really soft, light silt, but the heli-safe system with a helicopter, the stop about 6 to 8 inches up the line, it landed perfectly. So it's not a system that I wouldn't want to use that system over clean gravel because it's got lots of play, but it's a good lesson, I think, for inexperienced anglers is and the sort of guys we've talked about, the guys you've had on the podcast already, those sorts of guys will know through years of fishing experience that really clean bottom, short hook link, heavy lead, keep it all real tight and tidy. If you're fishing on sediment, you want to move your stops back, fish a helicopter with a bead back up the line a little bit, give yourself a bit more movement so that it's not all buried in the silt. And it's just knowing when to make those changes and learning through experience what that feels like when you donk your lead down. But if as I say, as a carp farmer, I see fish feeding in deep silt all the time. When we drain the lakes at the farm, you can see little pits in the bottom right across the deep silt where fish have been feeding.
We'll get onto that actually, won't we? We'll get onto that later about the carp holes.
Yeah, definitely.
So you wouldn't necessarily... So anglers are probably catching fish under the surface of the lake bed and not necessarily realising it at times.
I think so. Yeah. I know the PVA bag clip that you're alluding to. I saw that, and I think that probably you could have left that out there a month because it had plugged. Right. Because that setup was, if I remember rightly, was a really tight PVA bag. Yeah. Really, all the air sucked out. It was like a bullet. That's cast in. That hits the lake travelling at a hell of a speed. Not with my casting, it wouldn't. But if Daryl cast it might. And when that gets fired out, it punches into the bottom of the lake with some force down into the silt, and then the silt closes over the top of that. So you're effectively covering up your little parcel. What you want there is, if you'd fish that in a helicopter setup, you're laughing. Much better. Yeah, you'd be laughing. You'd be fishing right on top of the silt in full view. Fishing
where you want to fish, but fishing effectively. Yeah. Should we go off this subject a little bit and on to about you, Simon? So have you got any interests, hobbies away from fishing and fish farming?
Yeah, I guess so. Thinks frantically for something that isn't carp. What do you do in your spare time? I go carp farming, and in your spare time, go carp fishing, and in your spare time, watch carp. I'm into the wildlife, outdoors. I'm interested in birds. I like going walking. I'm an outdoorsy person. I spend a lot of time outside.
Was that always an interest of yours before you got into fishing, or did the two kind of work together?
As a kid, as a very little kid, I used to be fascinated in we had bird feeders. I used to get my mum to buy peanuts, and I remember we used to put fat feeders outside. I'd get bits of think it was pork fat on a skewer and hang them under the hanging tiles on the corner of the house. And if I see the blue tits coming and the woodpecker, I was delighted with that. I was fascinated in that. So anything outdoorsy and anything particularly outdoorsy around ponds, particularly where I grew up, we had a garden pond that was right outside the kitchen window, and I used to just spend hours and hours poking around in the margins, hunting newts, finding out what lived in the silt and that sort of thing. So that was, as a kid, I was very, very outdoorsy. I wasn't indoors person at all. And I suppose that sort of somewhere along the lines, I started to go fishing and catch fish. But
the fishing came after that a little bit then?
Yeah, definitely.
Was it encouraged by your parents?
Yeah, so my parents, when I was 2 years old, they bought a property, a very rundown old house with about 25 odd acres of land, and that land ran down to a tiny little river called the River Curd, which is it rises in a place called Curdford, and the only reason there was any river there at all was because at the end of the bit of land that my father bought, there was a weir, and that held the water back. So there was effectively a sort of section of still water for most of the year. And sometime around my 7th birthday, I was given a fishing rod. I remember, I've still got it. It came from a shop called Woolworths, which are no longer with us, but it had a white handle, and it was a red plasticky rod, and it had yellow sort of butt section had yellow at either end, and little metal eyes, and a red reel, and I went for my first ever fishing trip.
I think we all started off with that kit, didn't we?
Yeah, it's I don't know if people would now. I think they probably start off
a bit
with
more advanced
3 3/4 pound Tesco Daiwa rod, but yeah. So I started with that, and I caught a rudd on my first trip, and that was that. That was all I would do the whole time. I would just be fishing every single spare moment. Anything that lived in the water fascinated me, but this just opened up a whole new world. My imagination sort of combusted. What lived in that bit of river.
It's got to be an advantage as an angler, hasn't it, to have that interest as well as actually going fishing?
I think so. Yeah, I think the really, really, really good anglers that I meet are seeing a lot more than just the fish. They're the birds, the coots, the grebes, all the interactions between the different animals. The really, really special anglers that I know, they're watching the fine details of every coot twist and turn, because those are the little flags that say it's just gone over a carp, or where's that duck diving? That's a bloodworm bed there. Knowing a bit more than just going there and waiting for your buzzers to rattle off. Yeah,
it's those small percentages, isn't it? I mean, they're not necessarily going to be, being very, very good at observing stuff isn't necessarily going to give you an obvious result straight away. But time and putting all that stuff together,
it's the accumulation of observation, isn't it? And you see something.
You're filling that database up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the old memory card, filling up with information that you think, okay, last time I saw that happened, and you put bits and pieces together. I remember as a young carp angler being so frustrated with coots. I mean, these little black things would swim about, chirp, look down, and you'd see them look at you, look down, look at you, and the moment you started waving your hands, they'd go, found his baited spot. Because the more animated you became, the closer they were to the baited area. Then they dive, and eventually they'd pick up your hook bait, and be crisis point. However, now I'm quite a fan of coots, because they're...
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the bird life on the lake. And coots, although they can be a bit frustrating at bite time when they've done their work, but in terms of showing you spots, or if there's still bait on a spot. I remember being stood at Wraysbury with a really, really good angler. And we're looking out across the lake. He went, there's still some bait on Mary's table. I'm looking out at the lake thinking, Mary's table. So that's about 300 yards away from where we stood. And he'd clocked a coot come up with a boilie from 300 yards. And I remember thinking, okay, more work to do, Simon. But it's that level of detail, that it's the extra level. It's those little tiny 0.5% that are all adding up. And that
it is. I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily, or people would be surprised to hear that you suffered with dyslexia.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And and you ended up becoming a college lecturer, and you got a
every dog has
degree.
Its day, Simon. Yeah, when I was a young lad, I really struggled with. it's interesting. I meet a lot of fishy people that are dyslexic. So fishing and fish seems to attract dyslexic.
Well, I'm dyslexic as well. So,
but I remember really struggling with the schoolwork, and I've got a really, this is without making me sound emotional, but I've got a very bad memories of having to write. It's the right time of year because we're recording this just before Christmas, but I remember loving Christmas with just an insane amount of excitement for Christmas, but then dreading writing thank you letters with just a huge dread. The thought of having to sit down after Christmas and write my thank you letters was just excruciating, and my mother would not let me go fishing until I'd written all my thank you letters. And I lived in a village called Wraysbury Green. Now, if you're a dyslexic, that is a pretty serious word to spell, and I couldn't spell it. And despite repeatedly being told how to spell it by my mother in a rage, I could never spell it. I've just about got it now. Our house name was Amblehurst, and that as well was a tricky one. There's L's and E's and H's in there. So I couldn't spell my address. And my mother, I just remember being incandescent with rage how her son could not spell his own address at the age of 10. And anyway, somewhere along the line, fortunately for me, I think they must have clocked I had an issue at school, and I was diagnosed as being dyslexic. At that point, it was quite a new thing, dyslexia. It wasn't widely
during the age, yeah, very, very new.
And anyway, I had to go to an educational psychologist, and I remember my friend sort of telling me that I'd gone to a psychiatrist because I was loony. I'm being a little bit hurt about that. But I went to an educational psychologist, and he gave me a full assessment, and he said, actually, yes, you are quite severely dyslexic. And he basically wrote up a sort of a package of things that the school could help me do, and they had they were quite progressive in their approach to dyslexia. I was very fortunate, and there was a lady called Mrs. Thwaites, and she was our dyslexia tutor at the school. There was only about 5 of us that were state mentored, but she gave me a lot of extra help, and that made a big difference. And it just took the pressure off a bit. I got extra time in my O-levels, which would now be GCSEs. So I got, for every hour, I got an extra 10 minutes. And when you write slowly, that helps a lot. And so for a 3-hour, let's say, geography exam, I'd get an extra half an hour. Now, I was quite good at geography. I liked it. It was about the outdoors. I loved writing about glaciers and volcanoes and that sort of stuff. I really fired my imagination up. I couldn't get it out in time. But with the extra 10 minutes for every hour I was had in an exam, it made a big difference. I did reasonably well. So that was kind of a turning point.
What did that feel like? Because obviously you could understand what the teacher was saying, but you just couldn't get it down in writing.
I find it's frustrating, and I find it now. I can write a very good article in my head very quickly, but I can't write it down very quickly. It takes a long time to write an article.
Do you think the level of dyslexia that you've got has been reduced as you've got older?
I don't think it's been reduced, and my very patient wife Sue would say no, definitely. So I'll avoid writing Christmas cards now, because actually I get slightly anxious about writing and spelling a name wrong or something wrong. Quite good at writing. I'll write my wife a card, and I'll write the words in the wrong order, and then I'll read it back and think, and I'll throw it away and then have to write another one. That's happened a fair few times. Or I'll rip the card in half and throw away the first half and then write on the back of the colourful bit. So that happens, and I do that now. So fortunately we're lucky now, we're in a world of clever computers, so you've got a spell checker. So when I write an article, I can reread it. But I've still got some of my original articles that I wrote in longhand. Oh my God, and it just absolutely covered in scrawl. So we're past that. But yeah, I struggled at school. I've got a particular memory of sitting in English classes, and our English teacher used to make us read out loud. And I remember I can shut my eyes now and be back in that class and absolutely dreading it as it went along the line. It would go across the other side of the class and work down the line. Then it would turn right and come along the back of the class. Then it would turn right again and come down towards me. And I shared my classroom with one lady in particular who many of the listeners would have heard of, a lady called Minnie Driver, who became a Hollywood actress. And I promise you, she could read aloud so beautifully, and she could put the different characters had different voices, and she'd put all the intonation in. I would read it like, and then Macbeth said to Lady Macbeth that, And then our English teacher would go, I think that's fine, Simon.
That's very good, Simon.
Thank you. And you'd think, I literally read one line, Minnie would read a page, 100 miles an hour and make it sound amazing with all the characters and Lady.
So, yeah, I can imagine. So were you treated like, more inferior to your?
I definitely got. Not so much when I was doing my A levels, but when I was a bit younger, O levels I did, but GCSEs now I was definitely a bit. The fact that I'd had to go and have a special assessment, there was a little bit of like, he's a bit weird. But as long as I was fishing, I was fine.
And what about relationships with everyone at school? I mean, did that affect?
Yeah, I had a sort of small group of friends at school. I didn't, that had a similar interest in water, so that's always been a thread.
I think that's important going fishing, isn't it?
Yeah, I lived for the weekends and going fishing. I remember sitting and looking out the window at school and seeing the rain come down in December and thinking, it's going to be absolutely perfect for the end of that ditch on the river, that the ditch will be flowing, and where the ditch meets the main river, fishing a float with a bit of bread flake on about 10 foot below the float, there will be bream in that spot. I can clearly remember sitting there looking out the window thinking, that will be the spot today for bream. They will be there, and I'd been taught that was a good area and I'd seen it done. And I remember fishing.
Did everyone in your class know that you were a fanatical angler?
Yeah, I think probably suss that. I used to.
I think I realised why girls weren't interested in me at school. It's probably because I talked about fishing a little bit too much.
Yeah, that's not the coolest thing. I also had a couple of other quirky things. I'd have. I went to boarding. I was very lucky. I went to a nice boarding school, which was a saviour for me because I would have really struggled if I'd gone to a more sort of mainstream school. But at my boarding school, because I think I might have played the dyslexia card a bit here, but I was allowed to keep aquariums in my dormitory. So I had an aquarium in my dormitory. I was also allowed to keep tadpoles. So I would rear batches of tadpoles and then release them in ponds and stuff.
What's this, just to comfort you a little bit?
Well, that's what I'd use the comfort card, but I was just interested in anything like that. What made the tadpoles grow quicker and what food they like best and all of that sort of stuff. Yeah, so I was very lucky. I went to a very cool school called Bedales in Hampshire, near Petersfield. And as I said, that was where Minnie Driver went to school, and another girl who was in my class called Cherished Jagger.
I recognise that surname.
Her surname, her father was quite successful. And I do remember, this is slightly outside of what we're talking about, but I remember at Parents' Day once, my mother clocked Mick Jagger. Oh my God, you know those moments when you just die at school? That was that moment. My mother's eyes came about a clear foot out of her skull and she went, my father was called Fen, and she turned and went, Fen, there's Mick Jagger. And I was like, Mum.
You knew who Mick Jagger was.
I did know who Mick Jagger was, but the last thing you want is your mum walking up to another parent on a Parents' Day and going, hi, you're Mick Jagger. I'm your biggest fan. I can remember exactly. It was horrendous.
Oh, that's good. You were mentioning, you mentioned the other day actually about learning languages. Do you want to get into the story about how you decided to learn a language?
Yeah, I did. Well, I struggled, as we've touched on already. So when I was probably 14 or 15, I had a reading age of about 6 or 7. I really struggled at school with reading. So to read, I didn't like reading. I'm still not a mad keen reader. If someone sends me a 2-page email, you get a big groan. I find reading is not an easy experience. I love reading. On the table here, you've got Carp Now and Then, Rod Hutchinson's book, which I've got and I've read, but the story has to be really something for me to be hooked in enough. So reading was difficult. So I struggled with English. I had to do French at school, and I got repeatedly thrown out of French lessons because as a dyslexic, if you get left behind, of course, once you've fallen behind the group and you're not understanding the point that's been made by the teacher, well, what's the next best thing to do? Well, obviously you give your mate a jab in the ribs with your ruler, or you throw his pen on the floor. So you'd start to mess about because the whole group had moved beyond you. The 25 other kids or whatever were doing something, they'd gone way down the line, and I was still struggling with garçon or chat or whatever it was. So I got left behind, so I got thrown out. Anyway, to cut a long story short and to get back to your question, Simon, so I was in Ibiza, having promised my wife a holiday, which we hadn't been away for 5 years. Eventually, we ended up in Ibiza because I'd left it to the very last minute. That was the only place available, so we went to Ibiza. Now, we stayed in a very beautiful hotel in Santa Eulalia, and actually we thought we'd died and gone to heaven. I had decided, having not been on holiday for 5 years, that I could quite get into holidays. There was no clubbing involved, I might add, to the guys that are listening to this thing. Simon Scott, Ibiza, can you imagine him? Glow sticks at dawn. But we went to Santa Eulalia, and while we were in a restaurant there, we sat down, and the waiter came over, and I used to get slightly stressed when the waiters came over to me, but they obviously, being Spanish, they're brilliant at English as well, and they'd come over and ask us what, and I'd go, "Can I have, please, a large beer and a glass of white wine for my wife?" And I just remember thinking, it just sounds so horribly English bloke abroad. Anyway, at the table next to us, this English couple came in with their 2 daughters, and they sat down, and the waiter went over to them, and the gentleman turned round, and he just had a fantastic conversation in Spanish with the waiter. Now, it was fantastic to my ear at that time because, of course, I knew no Spanish. But I turned around to Sue and I said, "Did you hear that?" She went, "What? Can you talk to me and not mind what the table next door is doing?" I went, "Sorry, but did you hear that?" "What? That guy, he's English, but he spoke fluent Spanish." I said, that is so amazingly cool. Imagine being able to do that. Anyway, so we're now 5 years from that point, and I've been learning Spanish for 5 years. I could just about ask for a beer and a glass of wine in Spanish now.
You were talking about podcasts as well. You found podcasts listening in Spanish was
because I'm not, we've talked about the dyslexia and the reading. I don't like reading. So sitting down, having to do homework, which I now have to do for my Spanish classes, is still as painful as it was when I was 14. It's still horrendous. I love my Spanish teacher to bits. Ines is a fantastic teacher, and she's so sweet. But she still sets me homework, and I find that really difficult. But what I do find a good way of learning is I listen to podcasts when I'm driving back and forth to the fish farm. It's an hour from my home to the farm, so I get quite a lot of time in my van, and I drive along and I listen to Spanish. And I occasionally will have a break and listen to some music and sing along, but often I'm chatting Spanish to a podcast out loud, and people must pull up alongside me and think, God, he must be listening to a really boring song because he doesn't look very animated. But yeah, I find that works really well for me. So that's and it's helped. Yeah, I've made some headway.
Different ways of learning. Yeah. So you've got a Master of Science degree.
Yeah, that's right. I did a higher national diploma, which my classmates on my master's degree used to remind me that HND stands for have no degree. So I did my HND at Sparsholt College, which is they now do a full degree at Sparsholt, but at the time it was just a higher national diploma. And then I went to Plymouth and did a Master of Science degree in applied fish biology, which obviously by that point, when I went to Sparsholt, it was like being born into education for the first time, because I had gone through school really struggling. I'd managed by hook or by crook, mainly by cheating, to get to A-levels, and I'd got those under my belt. And then I went to Sparsholt, and all of a sudden I was being taught by fish blokes about fish, and the lights just went like Pam! Suddenly it was like, oh, I get this. And because I was massively enthusiastic about fish and quite an enthusiastic person, you had that sort of merging of my enthusiasm, fish, and really good teachers all coming together, and I just sailed then. I loved it. So I left Sparsholt after 3 years with a distinction, and having done 3 years and been, getting top mark, not necessarily top in the group, but like high marks all the time and like lots of distinctions. I felt very inspired and felt like I could go on a bit further, and so I went to Plymouth and did a master's degree. Did
you need any special help with those?
I did get extra time in my exams still. Yeah, I still played the dyslexic card because, of course, when you're doing a master's degree, you're writing serious essays. I had to do some quite chunky bits of work for that, and having a bit of extra time did help, because obviously at that point if you're writing sort of scientific stuff, you're writing some quite in-depth, and how you write's quite in-depth, but there's a certain way of writing, often writing in the third person. You just can't say I dissected the fish was dissected. So things like that I have to get my head around. So yes, it was a brave new world.
It's kind of led to other things as well, because I know you've done some TV work, didn't you say, with the pike, when you were trying to your first foray into TV?
So I met a lovely guy who's no longer with us now, but a lot of the listeners will know a guy called Kevin Green. Kev Green was a fantastic guy, and he had done a couple of little tiny bits and pieces with me at Sparshall, and obviously thought this guy's quite enthusiastic and he gets going, he can really chuck a story out. And we were talking about this and that, and he said, look, I'm going to do this series and we're going to call it Predators. Would you like to be on it? I was like, yeah, that'd be amazing. Yes, please, Kev. Yeah, what do I have to do? And he said, well, it's easy. You just hold up a predator, like a pike, and then you just have to talk about it. I thought, yeah, that'd be fantastic. And he said, well, do you know anywhere we could get a predator? And I went, yeah, of course. Yeah, that's easy. Yeah. We'll go net at Broadlands Lake down at Romsey. So I arranged this netting practical for my students at the college. Now, I hadn't really thought the whole process through. I had no experience of what filming would involve. So I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll go netting for the whole day with the students. This was a group of maybe, I think it was 2 minibusfuls, so it would have been maybe a group of 24 students. I didn't drive both minibuses, I just must point out. So myself and another member of staff took the group down. We had a trailer, we had all the netting equipment. We set our seine nets around the bays at Broadlands. We caught lots and lots of fish and some pike. And there was this guy called Andrew Hunt and a cameraman. And Andrew said, okay, Simon, so that's brilliant. You've got your pike. That's fantastic, as promised. So I said to the students, right, if you just have a quick tea break, I'm just going to go and do this little bit, about a pike to camera. And then I'll be back in 10 minutes. Now, as I say, I hadn't really thought this through very well. So at this point, Andrew gives me a script and says, so what I want you to say is this. And I'm looking at it thinking, a script? Kev never mentioned a script. What do you mean you need me to read something and then repeat it? And he went, yeah, so I just want you to read this bit about a pike, and then I want you to look down the camera and go, this is a pike. And I went, oh, brilliant. Okay, now bear in mind, I'm in my dry suit. It's January. It's freezing cold, and I've got a live, very frisky double-figure pike. And I went, yeah, okay, well, let's have a go. So I sort of got myself ready, and suddenly I felt like this camera is looking straight in my face. This is a whole new experience, and people are always a bit surprised when they first do some TV stuff that the cameras they're quite in your face, and I hadn't really thought that through either. And I look at the lens, and the cameraman Matt says, just look at the lens like you're just talking to me. And I'm thinking, I'm talking to the camera. And then I kept looking at him. He went, don't look at me, look down the lens. I went, okay, I remember. So I've got to look down the lens. Now, what was that script again? Sorry, let's try that again. Okay, let me try that one more time. And I could see this guy, Andrew Hunt, getting more and more stressed and more cold. I'm getting colder. The pike's starting to look a bit cross-eyed. Yeah, a bit tired and emotional. And anyway, I had to say, the lines I had to deliver are, and this is a pike with 700 razor-sharp, sickled shape, backward-facing teeth, all covered in anticoagulant. Anything that goes in this predator's mouth is never coming out alive.
You've got it now.
I've got it now. And I tell you, I could say it after 15 pints now. But at that point, on that day, it was absolutely horrendous. I must have been on, that take 1, take 252, and the pike was getting more and more sleepy and more emotional. Sleepy. I had to keep putting it in the water for it to recover. Yeah. And Andrew's going, do you think it's okay? I'm going, yes. Yeah. And I look back and I watched that original clips, the piece that went in.
Can we still drag that out now?
You would be able to find that now. I've probably got the DVD somewhere hidden at home. But you can see that the pike definitely looks a bit cross-eyed. It did swim off strongly after about 2 hours of recovering. I remember giving it to a student saying, can you make sure this pike's... I felt awful. Can you just hold it in the edge, make sure it stays upright, and then it'll swim away. And it did eventually. But I did it after that. I got the hang of it. And I also... I learned the lesson. Don't take a group of students and a big netting group. It's a day in itself to get the predator, do the film, learn the lines. And Andrew, after that, let me write the lines a bit so I could maybe tweak it slightly to my own way of saying things. He was a bit more theatrical in his lines than I would have been. I could be enthusiastic. Yeah, I could be enthusiastic in my own speech, but he had put in a few words, anticoagulant. I remember thinking as I was saying it, are they really covered in anticoagulant? But it's on the script, so hey, I'll just go along with the flow. And I remember someone watching it, and I think I got an email from somebody who knew a bit about fish saying, tell me about the anticoagulant. I just ignored the email. Delete. I did an Elliot Gray, just press delete, quick.
Yeah.
So, so after that, and then I then went on to do Carp crew with Kev. And by that point, I'd got the hang of doing my little bits to camera. But I remember the very first time we actually went to try and make a carpy pro. I was in Carp crew. It was stalking with Simon Scott on the blue pool, and Kev and I went round and had to catch the fish. And I remember Kev arriving in the car park, and I was like, Kev, quick. I've got like 19 spots around the margins, and they're absolutely, we cannot fail to catch carp. And he went, whoa. Stop, Simon. We need to film you getting the gear out of your car. I went, but the gear's already around the lake. He went, no, it doesn't work like that. You need to put all the gear back in the car. We need to unload it. Then we need to follow you round with the cameraman as you bait all the spots. I was like, Kev, but we won't. But 2 days later, I think I'd caught one fish. And that was like a really good introduction to actually the fishing filming thing. And I'm sure these guys like Daryl and Dan, obviously, they're doing loads and loads, and Neil and Tom Dove, they're doing a lot of filming. They will be all too familiar with it. But you are effectively, people say it must be amazing you're getting paid to go fishing, but when you're doing any filming, it just isn't fishing. It's like having, Mark Bryant says to me, remember, Simon, keep the enthusiasm up, but you're fishing with a handbrake pulled right on, as hard as it will go.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah, and you can't shoot off and go and catch one. And you can't just turn around and go, oh, by the way, lads, I've just caught one. I stalked out of the edge, because that is camera crew hell.
Yeah.
You need to tell the story. And I know that now, so I'm a bit calm when we go fishing.
So you were a lecturer at Sparsholt College for 20 years?
Yeah, I did 20 years. So I started at Sparsholt at the age of 26. I remember when I started thinking, my word, I'm virtually the same age as these guys. There didn't seem to be a great deal of age difference between me and the students. So I remember actually I had a guy called Tony in my very first year of teaching, and Tony was a mature student. He was 45. Oh. And I remember looking at Tony on the first day in class thinking, oh my God, you could be my father. I can't teach you anything. And he knew loads about salmon and trout. And that was probably I had done some trout farming. I'd been to salmon farms, and one of the jobs I'd had between my masters and teaching at Sparsholt involved a lot of work with salmon. So I had a good idea about salmon, but this guy Tony knew his spotties, as I call them, the salmonids. He knew them inside out, and I had to be very cautious with what I said about trout and rainbow trout and brown trout. He was on me in a flash if I was to diss them at all. But fortunately for me, most of the group were quite mad coarse fishermen, in particular carp. So we got on all right, and obviously after 20 years you've done a fair bit of teaching. I used to relish walking into a group, and I enjoy teaching.
It's great for this sort of stuff as well, isn't it? Because you're able to describe stuff and very, very clearly, and I think it makes it relatable to everybody, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, I think as someone with 20 years of teaching, and my wife Sue's the same, she's taught for a long time. When you can show someone something and they're really engaged and interested, whether it's a carp skull, pharyngeal teeth, a snail shell, and you can tell them a bit about it, and you're passing some information on and they get it, that's a nice moment. I remember in class, I had a particularly good group of students one year. Actually, within that group was a lad called Martin Rosier, who now works for me full time at VS Fisheries. But within this group, they were really keen, and in this particular group of students, there was 4 or 5 exceptional lads that were very, very good and very enthusiastic, and so they brought the whole group it was like the whole group got an uplift from their enthusiasm, and as a result of their enthusiasm, I put more into it, because it's sort of a two-way street, isn't it? The more enthusiastic you are, they were the same, and we just we revved each other up. And I remember one particular lesson talking to them about oxygen, and it was just like you could see the green lights going on around the class as they were getting it, and we just got into this massive debate about oxygen and the effect on feeding of fish, and it went on and on and on. And just a lovely group of students, and when you get that buzz off the students, that it makes you feel very good. You feel like you've done a nice thing. You've enriched them with some information. That's a nice thing to do. Passing it on is is a special thing.
Did you
isn't
say a large majority of your students are dyslexic as well?
Yeah, a lot. We used to see that a lot. Yes, yeah, a lot.
Why
of
do you think that is then, Simon?
I just think dyslexic people seem to gravitate to the outdoors, and I know a lot of people that do landscape gardening as well. So I love gardening. That's another thing. You asked me about my interest. I'm a passionate gardener. I like growing stuff. There's definitely in me that, But you meet a lot of gardeners and landscape gardeners that are dyslexic. So I think it's the outdoors. It's I suppose when you're at school, if you have a skill for computers and writing and reading, then you're kind of gravitating towards a sort of office indoors type thing. And I like growing stuff. You know, I had a vegetable patch when I was a kid. I don't in my new house yet, but I will have by next summer. And like last couple of years, we've virtually been self-sufficient for vegetables, and I think that's a great thing to do. And my grandson's 4, and we go out and we dig for potatoes, and that it's giving him a sense of where food comes from, and we plant the potato, we water the potato, and then we harvest it. And it's nice to pass that on. But I just fundamentally love growing stuff. I love growing pumpkins as well. That's anybody that follows me on Instagram will see. You get to about mid-October, and suddenly there'll be a post of a huge pumpkin. So, and having a grandson who's 4 and into Peppa Pig, and anybody that's watched Peppa Pig will know about the episode with the giant pumpkin. Grandpa Pig grows a pumpkin. Well, I allude to be Grandpa Pig, and I haven't needed a helicopter yet to move my pumpkin, but we're heading in that
way.
We're heading in that. It took 5 people, the last one, to lift it.
Really?
So, yeah.
Why? What did that weigh?
It was over 200 pounds.
Oh my God!
Yeah, it was a big.
Blimey.
It was a big pumpkin.
Pumpkin soup there as well.
Yeah, there was a lot of pumpkin soup. My wife's quite, we
Do you find with your students as well, because having that carp fishing kind of passion, it's a bit different teaching someone that's already coming into college with a passion like that in the first place? Have you got them on board more quickly?
It's difficult, because when I was teaching at Sparshot, they were coming to Sparshot to do a fisheries course, so they've kind of got a thread of what they might want to be fishermen or fishery work. I think we used to struggle from a lot of the lads and lasses that came on the course thinking it was going to be all about fishing, and there was more to it, because actually the jobs within the fishing sector are quite few and far between. But within fish farming, there's quite a lot of opportunities. I remember telling students, that were a bit unsure about what they might do, that maybe you should think about trying to get into fish farming. The other thing I used to say to a lot of the youngsters is that if you absolutely fundamentally follow your career path as fishing, you might find that time you're 30 or 40 years old, you're actually doing very little fishing, because it's knocked the passion out of you. I know obviously within this building here at Korda, you've got some guys that's their every life's breath is angling for carp. But people that are in the business a lot, particularly guys that run fisheries, often they just don't fish anymore. The last thing they want to do on their spare time is go fishing. So I used to say to a lot of the young guys, so maybe think about a job that's sort of fishy, fish farming, maybe go trout farming or salmon farming. If you could go and run, you could be working on a big trout farm, you get paid a lot, and then the weekends you'll go and fish for something that isn't a rainbow trout, it's a carp, and that's your passion. So I'm very, very lucky. I think quite rare that I'm the last, this time of year, I'm spending week after week immersed in cold water, juggling 25,000 carp up to 30 pounds. It's fantastic. I get a few people that say to me, and you actually seriously want to go and catch another one in your spare time. And there are points when you think, that is a good point. Yeah, I can see what you're saying there, but yes, I do. There is fundamentally a difference between, I'm a farmer, I like growing things, and then I like seeing how they've got on. At the end of when we're harvesting, you get a fish out of the pond and go, wow, that's done well. That's, for me, brilliant. I like sending it on to a customer, putting it in a fishery and seeing it go well. But I for my own fishing, I like to catch fish that I haven't necessarily been part of their life, and I like to catch, fishing a big lake where I'm an addict to the moment that buzzer goes. I used to wake up as a child when and dreaming about that moment. Wake up in your bedroom and go, oh God, oh no, it was a dream. I thought I had a bite. I still get that to some extent, and when that buzzer goes, I'm still like a cat on a hot
It's
tin.
wonderful. I mean, you take it for granted, don't you?
Yeah.
But it's not always easy to
I don't.
keep
It never happens that much.
Yeah, right. Yeah, when it does happen.
Yeah.
So talking about fishing for your own fish, VS Fisheries.
Yeah.
I mean, you've stocked a lot of lakes.
We have now, yeah,
over the years. So
we've
do you
been
wanna
going. Yeah, I'd love to. We've been going the best part of 12, 13 years now. We started at a little site in Hazelmere. This is myself and Viv Shears, who I was a lecturer with at Sparsholt. Viv and I were great friends, and Viv's more of a businessman than I am, certainly. And I had been growing fish, carp, and breeding carp in my garden pond and in a couple of other little ponds for a while. But I was giving them to friends to put in their garden ponds, and that sort of, wasn't fish farming. And Viv says, Scotty, we could, there's a chance here that we could make a business out of this. We could grow some fish, and we could rear them. And anyway, a chance came, and we had our first site, which was about 4 acres. And it was near Hazelmere. Two college lecturers should have known better than we went, yeah, brilliant, and we got the site, but we hadn't actually tested the pH of the water, which is the degree of acidity or alkalinity of the water, and the pH wasn't ideal. And we had one production cycle there, and it didn't go very well. We did produce some nice fish, and some of them are still alive and have become very big, but it wasn't the right site. And then I had a chance phone call while I was sat at my desk at Sparsholt. This guy rang me out and he said, you won't know me. I've read your articles in Advanced Carp Fishing. You seem to know a thing or two about carp. My mate has just dug a lake and he wants some advice. And I said, oh, right, that's fantastic. Where is he? And this chap said he's at Petworth. And I went, oh, right, okay. Whereabouts in Petworth? And he described. And I said, okay, well, I grew up in West Sussex. I know that area. And he said, well, his lake's just down the road, da-da-da. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I went and met the two farmers, and the rest is history. So they had 5 acres of water that we used the first year, and it's grown to a point now we have, best part of 60 ponds or lakes on the farm, and somewhere around 50 acres of water that we produce fish in every year.
Well, it's like a collaboration of different skill sets that run VS Fisheries, isn't it, really?
But then often a big look at Korda, for example, here, it takes different people's visions and skills to make a good team, doesn't it? Viv is brilliant at teaching, at talking to customers. He chats to customers for hours and hours all through the year, arranges the thing. Obviously he's part of the farming as well, but he's very good at doing the sort of businessy side of stuff. I prefer poking around, harvesting the fish in the mud. That's more me, but that would have been the place. That was where I was at school. It stayed the same. And it works very well. And we're very, very lucky now. We employ, I touched on already, but Martin Rosier, who was a Sparsholt student, lovely lad, who's fantastic. He's worked with us now for 10 years. Another chap called Bob Goddard, who's also a Sparsholt graduate. And then we've just taken on another lad called Will, who's part-time through the winter, but he's a Sparsholt lad. And then we have 2 or 3 part-timers. I must include my wife in that list as well. So Sue works every winter on the farm. Yeah, don't forget that. And she does some of the less fun tasks. And she's also my stress coach during the breeding season. So when we're actually in the hatchery, which is that job is definitely my baby. Sue is my right hand buddy. You mentioned
she was working at Sparsholt.
Yeah, she taught at Sparsholt for 20 years as well.
What was she doing?
She was working in this sounds terrible as a dyslexic. She was working in the learning support area. So she was dealing with dyslexic students.
Oh, great.
So she's the right person to marry me. So within my student group I had 44 students at that point. They were called the First Diploma of Fishery Studies group. Most of the 44, all 44 of them were probably pretty much dyslexic. None of them liked doing any coursework at all. But we had to teach them some maths. And I used to send them up to the Learning Support Centre. I'd say, right, you need to go to that building and be there at 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock had come. I'd get a phone call in my office at 1:10. None of your students have turned up. It's like, and then 1:30, 2 of your students have now come, but like they would just vote with their feet. They wouldn't go. It didn't matter. They just would not go to maths classes. So we eventually hatched a plan that this lady called Sue Westwood, who worked at the Learning Skills Centre, she came to one of my teaching team meetings and she said, "Hi, my name is Sue Westwood. I work in Brian Gilmont's team at Learning Support, and I've come to this meeting because we have to make this work." And I looked at my best mate Craig, and there was a little glint in my eye. I went, "Ooh, hello. Sure, we can make this work."
Right.
So we basically so we engineered it that Sue would come out on a netting practical. So she would, rather than me sending the students to her to do maths and them not turn up, she'd come out and show these lads that she didn't mind getting wet and muddy and get a bit of a handle of what they were into. And then they'd write down the weights of all the fish they caught. And then we basically engineered this, well, Sue engineered it. I can take no credit for my wife's very hard work. But she engineered it so that the students would effectively be doing sort of a project based around their netting and what they'd caught, but it was maths, but it was dressed up as fishery work. So they were looking at the number of carp, the biomass of the carp, how much food that they could eat. And then Sue built on that and then did a feed trial with little fish. Again, doing percentages, doing maths, doing adding, dividing.
That's very
But it was all
intuitive.
dressed up as maths. And of course, because it was around fish and feeding fish, the lads all loved it. And when they did the feed trials, Sue, of course, bright spark that she is, she said, "Right, lads, I want you to name all the carp." So they had a picture of every carp in the feed trial, and each group of students named their fish. So they had a Basil and a Mary and a Petals, and all these fish had names, and they had a little picture, and all the weights were recorded. And of course, they were doing maths all the time, but it was carp maths.
Yeah.
So a bit like me doing fishy learning at Sparshoal all those years before. But when you're doing something in a subject you're interested in, the learning becomes a lot easier.
Interesting.
So, yeah. Anyway,
you had your eye on a different prize as well.
Yes, I did.
What
yes.
was it, the chest waders that finally
I think,
lured her in?
Seeing this lady in a pair of chest waders grappling a 30-something pound mirror carp on her first ever netting, I thought, she is really cool. And anyway, yeah, we've been married, best part of 15 years. So.
That's a great story.
And Sue helps on the farm a lot.
Yeah.
So she still gets her waders on and grapples carp in the frost.
So you're farming fish up to, is it C7?
Yeah, C7. So we produce all of our own fish on site.
Yeah.
So we do spawning. We grow fish through C1s right through to C7. So I just explain what that means, Simon, because a question I often get asked on Instagram is when I write a lovely C4, people say, what does the C4 mean? Well, the C is nothing. It's not rocket science. I'm a dyslexic. It's not going to be rocket science. The C stands for carp, and the number indicates the number of summers that they've had. So a C4 at this point in the year, in the winter, is about to have its 4th birthday next spring in May. So we grow C1, C2, right through to C7. So we grow fish from literally fry from an eyelash right through to 32, 33 pounds C7s.
Wow, people are purchasing carp at that site. I mean,
Yes, they are. They are definitely, and it's good. Long may it last. But I would, the size I try to always steer people to. When Viv and I set the business up, our target was to sell C4s for summer fish, because at that size, a carp is 10, 11, 12 pounds. Maybe this year they're big, they're 14s. That is this, in my opinion, and I don't know that much about carp. Listen, I just sit and yak about them, but. If I was buying carp for my lake, that is the size to buy them, because they're very adaptable. They're like teenagers when they're C4s. A C4 carp goes into a new fishery, and it's a young, vigorous, healthy, hardy fish. It's very quick to adapt to new food sources. It learns its way around very quickly. If you take a 45 pound, actually I've heard a couple of stories of people buying big fish this winter. It's really interesting actually, and I've heard of a gentleman that bought some 40 pounders to put in his fishery. Wow, why would you not buy a 40 pounder? Because if you're trying to sell day tickets, which this guy is.
Sorry, what does a 40 pound carp cost?
I don't know. I don't sell them. But I don't know. I'm not going to get involved. A lot, many thousands. But it's a huge fish to buy. But this gentleman bought some 40 pounders, put them in his fishery, and they died. Because you're taking effectively like an old an old person and putting them in a new environment and expecting them to be adaptable and able to change to the environment, and also being able to change to being caught more perhaps.
They've been too nurtured.
Well, if these particular fish had come out of a big open lake,
Right.
I believe. So they hadn't been grown in a farm situation to big. They'd actually become big in a wild environment, but they'd been netted out of a reservoir and then sold as big fish. And this guy bought them and put them into his lake, and they died. So I just think to put a human spin on it, which I used to find with the students, if you put a human take on it, it helps you get your head around it. If you're a teenager and you go off to college, it takes you about 15 minutes of being a bit nervous, and then that's it, you're out. Yeah, let's go and have a fag, let's go smoke, let's go and drink some beers, let's go and do this, let's go chase girls. You're straight into it. You're adaptable, you can change, you can move house. Moving your house when you're a teenager, you've only got a bag full of bits, you're moved in 10 minutes. As you get older, if you say to an 80-year-old, right, what I want you to do now is start running marathons, and we're going to move all around the world. And you become, as we get older, we become less adaptable. A C4, in my opinion, a full summer fish, is a young, adaptable fish. It's hardy. It's able to cope much better. Now, as I said, as you've touched on, we sell C7s at the farm, which might be £30. By all means, buy some of those, and I'd like everyone listening to this to buy them. But of course, all of them. But I would say buy one or two big ones. If you're setting up a new fishery, buy a couple of target fish, buy a 25-pounder, but don't build the whole lot like that. Get some younger fish in, which will settle in better. And often what you see 10 years down the line is that the 20s have only grown a little bit. Maybe they might have gone from £20 to £30, but often what you see is the C4s have overtaken them, and they're 45-pounders now. And this autumn has been a really, for Viv and I, it's been an absolute buzz, because I've been looking at pictures on Instagram and in emails of fish after fish after fish over £40 that Viv and I stocked from the business 10 years ago when we were starting out. And when you're seeing those pictures now of fish that were bought as C3s and C4s, and they're 44s, 45s, 39, 12, nearly 44, 42, and you think, the business is, suddenly there's hundreds of 40-pounders coming through. And a question people ask me is, how big is the biggest carp that VS Fisheries has so far produced? Well, I know of three, there's one that's no longer with us, but there are now, I know, 3 different 48s, and one of those, Andy Stafford from the Woolpack fishery, bought them as C3s. They were being 4-pounders, and he sent me a picture of a fish this autumn, the Boss, at 48, just over 48 pounds, and it's just an absolute tank of a carp. And when you see that, you think that's the way it should be done. Get them young, C3s, C4s, and let them come through and become monsters.
Yeah, I can speak from experience with your fish. C4s that went into our lake.
Yep.
And they've put on £8 plus already.
Yeah,
they're going to do 10. I think they're going to do £10 in a can. Some of them.
That is an exceptional growth rate. I mean, that's a lovely question. I get asked a lot. How fast will these carp grow in my lake? And that is the proverbial "how long is a piece of string" question, because there are so many variables. All I can say to people normally is, well, at the farm, if I kept this C4 for another year, if it's £12 now, it might be 16, 17, 18. If it goes into an exceptional pond, like the one you've just mentioned, they could easily be 20-pounders. If it goes into really heavily stocked water where there's been little attention to the stocking density and the water quality, and maybe the fishery management hasn't been as well addressed, then their growth rates, they might only put on half a pound, or might not grow at all. So to get fish to grow really well, you do need to get all the stars to line up. You need to do your homework.
Right. Talking about longevity as well. So would you expect your VS fish to be able to live to the time sort of spans as, say, Leany carp?
I think that's a good question, and one I have been asked before. I think we have to look at the world of carp fishing has changed a lot. Some of the Leany carp that you're talking about, they never got caught much during their first 20 or 30
unmolested
years.
For a long time.
They had a lot of time swimming around, and occasionally they'd look at a really crude parboiled potato and think, why would I want to eat that? And then some bloke called Rod Hutchinson discovered or was it Chris Yates? But the baits developed. I know obviously Rod Hutchinson and Kev Maddox, and the baits developed, the techniques developed. And so we're in a world now where, obviously within this building here at Korda, that the level of angling, the techniques, and also the tackle has evolved to such a degree. I mean, it's not just one or two anglers that are fishing 120 yards out and landing it on a sixpence. Loads of guys do it now. The tackle is fantastic. The technique, whether it's wrapping your rods up, the lead setups, the equipment has evolved so much through the creative minds of Dan and others, that the actual methods for catching the carp have come on such a long way that the carp are under more pressure from day one. So I think that's important to say that. However, I think that there's no reason why our carp shouldn't last for a very long time. I have got garden pond fish which I picked as a student on a work experience, which is still alive today, and I still use those bloodlines in the hatchery now. So I'm using, for example, leanies are often in the hatchery at spawning time, and I don't always produce pure leanies, because one thing that I like is to produce a bit of vigour and try and mix things up a bit. I think that's healthy for the animals. If you cross brothers and sisters with brothers and sisters, you get what we call inbreeding depression, which is a reduction in the performance of the offspring, which is why people on the Isle of Wight... No, I'm only joking. But so it's important to try and get a bit of extra vigour. And if you take two discrete strains and throw them together in the melting pot in a mixing bowl in that hatchery, you're effectively taking the very best of two different bloodlines. So, for example, the bloodline we call the North Harrow-Waltonian fish, those original fish grew massive in a time of not so much bait. We've got obviously that bloodline. If you take that and then cross that with a leanie, a big fully scaled leanie, you're taking the best of the good looks of the leanie and possibly putting a bit of that high-backed humpiness, big bruiser of fish, the Harrow, and you put those two together. Some of the offspring are going to look like mum, some are going to look like dad, and hopefully you get a fair lot in the middle that look like the best of both worlds. Yeah. And so it's the variety. And what I tend to do within the hatchery is I use maybe 5 or 6 different female fish and maybe up to 10 males every breeding season. So that hopefully ensures that we're getting a real good mixture going out of the hatchery. That was always the sort of target, is to create 100 fish that will look a bit different.
Right, okay. I mean, the Harrow, taking a fish out of a water like Harrow for breeding, I mean, did that sort of set a precedent at the time?
That was, without doubt, the most stressful 24 hours of my life.
It was
quite cool. So the guys from North Harrow-Waltonian spoke to us at the farm, they spoke to Viv and I, and they said, this is our project. Now, these fish are very old, and we'd like to try and get the bloodline to continue. So we had a couple of meetings. I met with them a couple of times at Sparsholt, and Sue, bless her, did them tea and scones at home, and we chatted about carp lots in our conservatory, and we sort of got this. So the plan was hatched, and the plan was that we had some really good Sutton strain fish at the farm, which had come through Viv, and we had these at Sparsholt, and because we always had tanks of brood fish at Sparsholt College. And the Sutton fish are lovely fish. Obviously, it's a very famous fishery. It's produced lots of lovely fish. And I said to the guys from North Harrow-Waltonians, look, I'm not prepared to take a 50-pounder out of its environment where it's been living for the last 30-odd years, inject it with a hormone that will stimulate it to release its eggs into the body cavity, strip it, and then return it to you, because that is just too risky. That would be one of your very biggest, very oldest female fish. I think at that point there was only about 8 or 9 of the originals left. They were all huge fish. So I said, what I'll do is I will take a male from the lake. If you can catch me one of the 20 or so male fish that are the original males, so they were still 30-odd pounds plus, 36 to be precise. I could take that fish back. If it's caught at the right time of the year and it's producing sperm, I might not need to inject it. I can collect that fish in a transport tank, which we can fill with water from the lake. It can stay in the sack that it's sitting in the lake. Once it's been caught, it was sacked. It could then travel to Sparsholt. It could stay on the trailer in its tank of lake water, which I can gently put oxygen through to keep the oxygen levels comfortable for the fish. I could then go through the hatchery process with the female Sutton fish, in itself a very famous strain. And then when I've got a bowl of eggs, I could go out to my trailer. I could take that unhooking, that sling out of the transport tank, put on an unhooking mat, roll the fish over, and if he's in the right condition and we're on the right kind of week of the year, he could produce some sperm, and I could just take a pipetful, and then I could put that on that bowl of eggs. And okay, they aren't going to be pure Harrows, but they're going to be a Harrow-Sutton cross. And that's what we did. Now, I had done the same thing with another male, a very big zip linear previously, so I knew it kind of worked, and that was a pet fish of mine. So I knew
We've got a picture later, Tobe, for that one.
Okay. So I thought, well, this could work. So what we did is as I described, and I went out there at 2:00 in the morning with Viv, and we rolled this big harrow male over, and I gave him a squeeze. No sperm. I'm thinking, come on, just one tiny drop. So I gave him a bit of a harder squeeze. No sperm. I'm thinking, oh, please. I'm thinking I should have injected it. Gave it another squeeze, and with the third squeeze, this little pinhead prick of white, real white creamy sperm appeared on the vent, and I got a pipette and just sucked it off his vent, popped him back in the transport tank, back in the sling. He's back in his water, as far as he was concerned. Apart from having a little bit of a squeeze, nothing too dramatic had happened. Went indoors, and I put that sperm on the bowl of eggs, the Sutton female eggs, and the fertility was fantastic. And those fry, that we then grew them through the farm. And then what we did is we took the characteristics that most matched the harrow fish off the fry, and those are the ones that I've subsequently line bred through. So I've used that line now.
Isn't that cool to know exactly what fish that came from?
Yeah, it is. But I do know that with quite a lot of our brood fish. So I can be catching fish, and out of the ponds at the farm, and we harvested some C5, so 5 summer fish this week, and they were between 14 and 23 pounds. And as I'm lifting them up out the muddy water, you can clock straight away, right? That one comes from the zip linear. That one comes from this one. That comes from one of the leanies. This one's the long scaly males. You can just see some of those characteristics carry perfectly.
Because I know you got black mirror.
Yeah, we've got some black mirror offspring in the pot as well, which we use.
Can you identify that fish?
Yeah, they look a lot like scattered mirrors, though.
Do they?
Yeah, so not as easy as some of the others. But my big zip linear, for example, which he's no longer with us now, but he grew to 30 odd pound and over 3 foot long in my garden pond, which is just a garden pond, I might add here, for people thinking, how big is his garden pond? It was 20. My garden pond was 30 foot by 6 foot and 6 foot deep. And Zippy lived in there, and I picked Zippy when he was about 4 inches long, and along with 50 others, and his sister is still alive now in the garden pond. But I used Zippy's sperm to fertilise again a bowl of Sutton eggs, and we keep the zip linears from that cross. And that fish in particular, grew to 3 foot in my garden pond, and some of his offspring have become enormous. And his brothers and sisters, which live. Zippy's original brothers and sisters, some of those went to a place over which a gentleman called Kenny Gates is involved in. And I won't say any more, but some of them are about the size of this table now.
Yeah, they're quite
and they are, you can see, they look exactly the same as the zip linear I had. They are definitely, same batch of fish. Anyway, that zip linear, his offspring have often got a little pale fleck right on the shoulder, and you can see that even in the scattered mirrors that he produces. You can see that little fleck. You think,
wow, I know it.
That was my boy.
Yeah. But the harrow fish went back, and it
so we
carried on.
So we spawned the fish, and that morning I checked the fertility. I had 3 Sutton females, and I injected all 3 of them, and the best one went first. Then the second best one went second, and the not so good one went third. So I binned the third batch of eggs completely, but the first 2 females were perfect, and the eggs were good, and we kept those fry. And once I checked the fertility under the microscope, one of the amazing things with a carp egg, it's appropriate that we've got the embryo picture in front of us here, but within a couple of hours of fertilization, you can see the development. So you can check the fertility of a carp egg very, very quickly after it's been fertilized. So once I was happy that the eggs were fertilized, I was happy that the hatchery that the college was sort of shut down, the eggs were safe in the jars. You feel a certain amount of stress because one pump breaks down at that point, they're all dead. But I left them, and I hooked up my trailer with my white transport tank and grabbed a couple of students that wanted to come for an adventure, and we drove back to North Harrow Waltonians with the fish, and we literally reversed into the car park exactly as I'd driven out, took the lid off the white tank, lifted the sack out of the tank. This fish, which is now called the donor, is going absolutely berserk. It was like this. It was a 36 pounder. It was like a big lump of mahogany. He's going bonkers. Put him in the margins of the lake, undid the zip, and he just went charged off into the lake as if to say, "What was that about?" And
It's like being abducted by aliens.
Yeah,
really,
yeah,
isn't it?
exactly. And to the best of my knowledge, I might be wrong, but the last I heard, he was still alive, and I think about 40 pounds. So he's still going.
Great.
And his children, and his grandchildren, and his great grandchildren, and probably now his great great grandchildren are spreading far and wide.
Yeah. Well done, the donor. Simon, I wanted to talk to you about leather carp because there's always this debate about what is a true leather. So maybe we should get into this a little bit.
This is a nasty can of worms. Thank you.
So leather carp, they're something of a genetic miracle, aren't they?
Yeah. So what is a leather carp? Okay. First of all, there are two schools of thought here. There is the carp angling school of thought that a leather carp has got no scales. But what you have to look at is, where did that term leather carp come from? Well, it actually came from carp farmers who have created a carp that they actually had a certain set of characteristics that they described as a leather carp. And now a leather carp is something you can produce through genetics, and actually we at the farm, we produce some leather carp every year because they're always popular with the customers. And the characteristics that you see with a leather carp are as follows. Firstly, it is very sparsely scaled.
Toby, put the picture up of a
I've
leather
got
carp.
good one here. One sec.
Okay, yeah.
Have we got one to look at?
Yeah, we have, yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you ready to go with that?
Yeah, give me a second.
Sparsely, yeah.
There's very sparsely scaled. So it's although carp anglers will tell you, and if I post a picture on my Instagram account of a leather carp and it's got a couple of scales, I very quickly get guys going, Simon, I'm afraid that
should be on screen for you.
There we go. So there you go. That's exactly the picture I posted. So if you look towards the wrist of the tail of that fish, for those guys that are listening and not able to see this, so on this fish's wrist, right in the middle of the wrist, on its left-hand flank, there is one single mirror scale, and then about in sort of real fish terms, there's about 2.5 centimetres above that, there is another single scale high on the wrist. So this fish only had 3 or 4 scales on the whole of its body. Now, there are carp anglers that would argue, well, because it's got 3 or 4 scales, actually, that's not a leather carp. But I promise you guys that is a genetic leather. That is what a carp farmer would call a leather carp. Now, a leather carp, we create them on the farm through using a male zip linear, and we cross a male zip linear.
Could you put Zippy up, please, Toby?
Yeah, of course.
We're going to cross a male zip linear with a normal scattered mirror, and the effect that gives you, if that cross is that we get 25% commons, 25% zip linears, 25% leathers, like the one we've just looked at in the picture, and 25% scattered mirrors, a normal mirror carp. So a zip linear, heterozygous zip linear crossed with a normal mirror will give you 25% commons, 25. And I'm afraid, being a dyslexic innumerate who hated maths at school, I find it hard to get my head around, but the way the genetics work is exactly right. So when you harvest a pond where you've done that cross in your brood fish, you will see 25% of each of those different types of fish. And 25% of those fish will be genetic leathers, and they will have the characteristics that we've talked about. So they will have very few scales on the body. In extremely rare situations, they may be completely nude, but in my experience of carp farming and fishing for a long time, a completely nude leather is a very, very, very rare animal. Some of them will have just 1 or 2 scales. Some of them may have a fair few scales. What you'll see, the scales are often on the wrist of the tail. So like a square scale either side of the wrist of the tail. You often get 1 or 2 along the dorsal line. You don't get scales around the area behind the gill plate like you would in a mirror carp. So that's the scaling. Other things to look for. If it's a true leather carp, it will have a punctuated dorsal fin. So when you look at the dorsal fin of a normal carp, if you can imagine the dorsal fin of a normal carp, if you look down there, you'll see there are bony rays in that dorsal fin to support the fin structure. In a leather carp, you get what we call a punctuated dorsal fin, like a punctuation mark. So a punctuated dorsal fin means that in the centre section, there are rays missing. Now, if that photograph we just looked at, there we go, you can see it beautifully in that picture. So you can see there are a couple of little scales there, but that's the dorsal fin of that leather carp, and you can see it's punctuated. So in fact, this is very extreme.
And there's the scales on the top there.
Yep, so you've got a couple of scales there. You've got the leading edge of the dorsal fin, the first bony ray, and then a couple more rays, and then right at the end of that fish's dorsal fin, there's a couple more rays there. So this fish has got a punctuated dorsal fin, so it's very, very common in leather carp. Another thing to look for is the anal fin ray count. So the bony rays.
Picture of that too.
Yeah, I've got that one.
So the anal fin, if you look on the anal fin of a leather carp, what you'll see is it's got less of the bony rays in it that you would get in a normal mirror carp.
So how many rays would we likely to find on a leather carp?
4, 3 or 4. It is variable, but 3 or 4 as opposed to normally 6 or 7 or 8 in a normal anal fin.
Toby, I've got that picture. If you could put that for the listeners, the watchers, that would be interesting to see.
There you go. That's fantastic. So that is our leather carp's anal fin, and you can see that I've got it between my thumb and finger there. I'm holding the first bony ray, the leading edge, and then there's 1, 2, 3 more bony rays, and only the second one there is a significant ray. The others are pretty well nondescript. They're not strong rays either.
Okay.
So that's common. Now, if that was a mirror carp, you'd have more rays, and that might be 7 or 8 rays there.
Okay, and what about the rounded tails and the little?
Yeah, now I know you'll be thinking about the Yateley carp here. So, for example, the dustbin. So the withered fins look is very, very commonly associated with leather carp. Now, one of the really fascinating things about leather carp is if you compare their ability to regenerate fins compared to a common carp, for example, their ability to regenerate fins is massively reduced. It's reduced from, if you take the common carp as your 100% marker, so if you damage the fins of a common, they will grow back 100%. Compared to that, a leather carp regenerates fins about 25%. So fin damage in a leather carp is really significant, and it's almost permanent. Now that means as that fish is living its life, it's swimming around in its environment, every time it brushes against weed or snags, it's abrading the edges of those fins. And because the leather carp's ability to rebuild fin tissue is so severely restricted, it really struggles to regenerate that material. So what you tend to see is that leather carp, as they become old fish, they often have very, very reduced finnage, and you'll see the pectoral fins can be tiny, the tail might be really rounded like a love heart, just a little stump on the end. So yeah, that's a factor. The other thing, there's a couple of things you can't see as easily, but poor old leather carp, they've got less red blood cells. So what does that mean? Well, that means if the pond deoxygenates, if the oxygen level in the water that they're in deteriorates and drops, they can't cope with that. They haven't got the red blood cells, so their ability to withdraw oxygen from the water in the gill is hampered. They've also got less white blood cells, so that means that their ability to have a fight off an infection is reduced. So you've got a fish that's not only quirky to look at, but might have little withered fins, but also its ability to sort of survive poor environments or diseased environments is hugely reduced. And lastly, and this is a factor the Yateley anglers are going to like, but a leather carp's ability to utilise its fat reserves is also hampered. So one of the things that's quite interesting is that the dustbin in Yateley and heather used to get caught during the winter. They were quite regular, not regular in Yateley terms, so once a winter or once every other winter, but they used to get caught. Those two fish would get caught in the winter, and there's good reason for that, is that they're not able to utilise their fat reserves as well as some of the other fish. So, for example, Chunky could sit on the bottom, big mirror carp, 44-pounder, could sit on the bottom all winter long, and he'd think, you know what, I don't need to eat boilies today, why take a risk, because I've actually got plenty of reserves. But the poor old dustbin, maybe get to December, and he'd be thinking, I'm getting a little bit peckish. Oops, oh dear. Trip out on the bank to be photographed. So it's quite interesting. So that hopefully answers that question.
Does it affect their lifespans as well? Do you find that leathers don't necessarily live as long?
They can in a pristine. Obviously, we're talking about the car park lake a bit here. That is a pristine environment. So in a pristine environment, so no oxygen problems, no disease issues, a healthy diet, they can live a very long time. So I would expect them to have a long life. But if they're in an environment that's difficult, oxygen crashes, disease outbreaks, they're going to be the first to go.
You would notice those first of all.
You'd see them die off first.
I've noticed some leathers that I've seen, the characteristic is a very, very long, they're like lizards, very, very long fish with small tails. Is that just from a certain brood of leather carp?
Yeah, that'll probably be from that particular genetic line. So we produce some quite high back leathers and quite deep-bodied fish, but again, that's because, as I've touched on, that Zip linear that we often use, I've mentioned him already, if we cross Zippy with, let's say, a harrow mirror, deep-bodied fish, then you're gonna get some quite deep-bodied fish. So the shape can vary depending on the bloodlines you're using.
Right. Okay.
But the characteristics of the scaling and the fins is the same.
Well, I've noticed with those fish actually, they all tend to be a similar age as well.
Yeah. So it's probably one farm or one farm's produced a big hit of fish and they've been spread around, and that's where they've ended up in that lake.
They're just wonderful fish, aren't they?
Yeah,
I think they have a bit more character, don't they?
I think the thing is, the beautiful thing about leathers is it's the variety, isn't it? If you're fishing a lake and they're all mirrors and you catch the leather, it's exciting because they're rare, generally a bit rarer. We certainly get demand for them at the farm, and every year we produce a few to drop in with the orders. In the same way with zip linears, everybody loves a zip linear, but if you had 100 of them in your lake, it'd become boring. So it's having that mixture.
It's that uniqueness, isn't it?
Yeah.
I remember seeing a friend catch a particular leather carp out of a lake, and just seeing those broken little, they're all a little bit deformed and they look a little bit weathered, but they're just so different and unique, aren't they?
Yeah.
And,
You're like a character fish.
Yeah,
I
of
can
course
see.
you do. Yeah. Okay, just moving on. Thanks for that, Simon.
That's all right.
That was intro. Hopefully that clears a few.
Well, it won't. No, there'll always be guys that will
up.
say, no, he's got 2 scales. That's not a leather carp.
Well, the first one, I caught a very well-known leather carp out of our lake, and I landed it at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I looked in the net. I knew which one it was because it's so long, and then it's got these great big armadillo scales on its back, and it's like, hang on a minute, is that the one? But it's got big scale, but you can't really see those scales. They blend in. They're right on top of the body, and you can't see them. But that was why I probably asked you the question as well. Moving on, retaining fish. Simon, I think we should probably ask you this. If you caught the Berfield Common, say in November at 2 a.m. in the morning...
I'd do self-takes in the dark and slip it back.
Would you?
Yeah. And then I'd ring my wife and go, I'll be home in an hour. Get the bottles out. Get the bottle of champagne out.
Generally speaking, should we be retaining fish?
Okay. I think in general, no. If you can do self-takes, and I think now we're in a world of fantastic digital cameras. You can get a reasonably priced digital camera with a flip-round screen that enables you to take really good self-takes. Having said that, I understand that if you catch the fish of your dreams, and whether it's you're fishing your local club lake and you catch the biggest fish and it's £19.12. If it's the biggest fish and it's the fish you're after, then it's as significant as me catching a monster somewhere else. So, wherever you're fishing, if you catch the big one, you're the king, aren't you? So I think if you catch that special fish, if you need to retain it, then there's a few things to think about. Firstly, the time of year. How warm is the water? If the water is very, very warm, then it's going to hold less oxygen than cooler water. So hot water in the summer, so August time, September, maybe June, July, depending on what it takes a bit of common sense is if it's been really hot in June. But if the weather is really, really hot, then the oxygen level in the water's ability to actually hold oxygen drops. So if we take this glass of water, picking up the glass here, which is half full, if that water was hot, it would hold less oxygen than if I put it, if I cooled it down. Then if this glass was full of cold water, it could actually contain more oxygen. So that's quite a fluid and dynamic thing. So that's important to be aware of that. So if the water in the lake is warm, it's holding less oxygen. So that's one thing to think about. Significantly, if the water in the lake is warm, the fish's metabolism is going faster. So warm water holds less oxygen. Warm water means that the fish's metabolism is going quicker. A metabolism that's going quicker needs more oxygen. So you've kind of got a double-edged sword thing going on there. So I would say during hot weather, particularly in high summer, I would avoid sacking and retaining fish as much as you possibly can, because that is when they are the very, very most vulnerable. If it's a big fish, get it in the landing net. Don't lift it out the water. Leave it in the landing net. Secure the landing net. If you can, take the rig out of the fish's mouth safely with it in the landing net. Get the landing net wedged in, extra bank stick, whatever. Then give your friend a ring, and then get it out just once to do the photos. That's getting the fish out, unhooking it, weighing it, ringing your mate, putting it back in the water.
It's not the one.
The more times you lift that fish in and out of the water, the more times you're risking damaging that fish. So if ever I catch a big fish, I get it in the landing net and think, okay, that's a proper job. Let's get organised.
Right.
That's something to think about. So high summer, avoid sacking. Weed is another thing to think about, how much weed there is. So particularly in the summer months, when that water's warm, if it's very weedy at night, weed beds are respiring, they're sucking up the oxygen that's available in the water column. So warm water that's weedy is an absolute no-no. So I think you need to think about where you're fishing a bit. You know, we all love our carp. We go fishing to see these lovely creatures. We've got to do our very best to look after them. So I would say wherever possible, try not to sack fish. Get the hang of that self-take photography. When you can do that and you're confident, then, you know, I quite often I've given people my camera and thought afterwards, why didn't I just stick it on the tripod? They've cut my head off or an ear.
We've all
or
been in that position.
Yeah, so get good with the self-takes and then you don't need to think about it. And it doesn't matter if you catch, you know, if it's in the middle of a torrential rainstorm in January, then just secure the fish in the net and wait for the rain to pass.
Yeah, there's not a great need for that, is there?
No, the quicker that fish is back in its own environment, out of the stress situation, the better it is for the fish, definitely.
Actually, talking about sacking and retaining fish and nets and stuff, KHV, can that be transferred through wet nets?
Yes, so KHV, all the evidence would suggest that KHV can be transmitted through fish mucus. So if you're fishing a busy water where you're going to get, talk about wet nets. My nets are often wet through rain, not through carp slime. But if you catch a fish and you've got mucus on your net, and then you roll it up, leave it wet, and then go to the next fishery the next day, and that mucus is still there and still wet, that can be a vector for the disease. So if you're the sort of person that travels from lake to lake to lake to lake, and obviously, you know, some guy, that's the way some people like to fish, then I think you have a real responsibility to make sure that you dry your tackle out between each venue.
And when it's dry, that's it. It's the disease
making it increasingly difficult for the disease. Yeah,
right,
the virus don't wet, damp, slimy conditions are perfect for harbouring big, you know, that virus. So dry the kit out, rinse it at home under a tap, leave it to hang out, and then it's good to go the next time. Or, and I'm not trying to sell tackle here, but if you are the sort of person that might fish 2 or 3 venues, then just get 2 or 3 landing nets. Just mix it.
It sounds a luxury, but I mean it's not, is it?
Oh no!
You can destroy a fishery.
If you visit a venue that is suffering a big carp mortality, it's absolutely heartbreaking. I mean, obviously, as a fish farmer, I dread seeing lots of dead carp. But when you visit a fishery where you might see 200 dead 20s all floating, that is just gut wrenching. It makes you feel.
Do you think we've done a better job with that over the years? I mean, obviously, we're a lot more aware of it now. Have you noticed the difference?
I think mortality still occurs. Yeah, I think they're still about. I think that's you know something.
Having a koi carp in a lake or a ghost carp.
Oh right,
is that potentially?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's difficult because I look in the angling press and you regularly and on Instagram you'll see pictures of people holding very big, colourful fish. I'm not a great fan of those. And I've caught some very big koi, but I'd like to see them in koi ponds or in a garden situations, not in fisheries. Now the reason is not because I'm some sort of purist snob who thinks, oh, I only like to catch brown carp. The reason is because if you are effectively, if you post pictures like that or you show photos like that of colourful fish, you're saying, look what I've caught this big colourful fish, and loads of young people are going to see that and think, oh, I'd like to catch one like that too. They could also think, hey, we've got a couple of koi in the garden. What we could do when they get too big, hey, if we put them in the local lake, wouldn't it be cool to see how they've got on? And I bet you a lot of the ghosties around now, exactly that's how they've got to where they've got to. They get too big for the tank. They get too big for the garden pond. Well, what are we going to do with Finley? They don't want him at the local garden centre. We can't kill him. I know. We'll put him in the local lake. Well, that is potentially a very easy route to take a disease from your garden pond where it might not represent or look like there's a problem and put it out in a fishery where it could cause a big problem. Because diseases like KHV, koi herpes virus, they can have no external symptoms on the fish at all. So you could have a 10-pound koi in your garden. It could be a beautiful bright orange koi or a ghost koi, and it could look, for all intents and purposes, as just absolutely like a new penny, brimming with good health. But that fish could be carrying that virus. And if you then put that fish in a lake where those fish have got they've had no previous exposure to that virus, it can cause a disease outbreak, and that could potentially kill, in some situations, 80 or 90% of the stock. Now, just to put a human spin on that, that would be like the first Europeans going to Australia and the Aborigines dying from the virus that we call the common cold. Doesn't kill you or I. We get a snotty nose and felt awful for a few days and take some Lemsip. But when the first Europeans went to Australia, the Aboriginal population, which had had no previous exposure to the common cold, were being killed by it.
Yeah. Do they carry that virus around for a long time?
Yeah, they're carriers, and they can
for all their lives.
And the problem is I always, when I used to teach as Posh, I would put a human spin on this in a big way, because I used to link it with AIDS. So if you think of HIV/AIDS, that disease, with all the billions of pounds of research put into researching that disease, things have moved on a long way now, and I understand, of late, that now there are drugs, antiviral drugs, that can basically control the viral count, and it's even possible to reach a point where you can be the virus has appears to have disappeared. You're not going to pass it on. So that's huge research, but I don't know how many years HIV has been around, but 25, 30 years, billions of pounds of research money. Fish disease is poorly understood, very, very poor. People talk about the NHS not having enough money. Well, the Environment Agency and the organisations researching fish diseases have even less money. Those guys, they're a handful of guys doing the fish disease research with very poor funds. It's very difficult for them to do the research. So as anglers, we have our own responsibility. If we know that there have been koi herpes virus, the clue's in the name, koi herpes virus. If we know there have been a lot of disease. That disease is quite widespread in the koi world. By encouraging, if you like, by posting or holding up pictures of koi and stuff, you're encouraging youngsters to go, I'll put one in my local lake. We have people ring the farm and say, do you sell koi? No, it's like, no, we definitely do not sell koi or ghosting.
So you think that's probably the biggest cause of that virus?
It's a good way of spreading that virus.
Yeah.
And I think of how many lakes, particularly not club lakes, particularly park lakes. I can think of a lot of park lakes that have the obligatory koi swimming around in them, or ghosty. And so, and of course, if you fish there and then you go to another place, you're potentially passing that virus on. So
yeah, interesting to know. I think Danny mentioned before, I got to ask a question about Gigantica for you, Simon, actually. He's noticed that the fish hardly show there during the day, but once it's dark, they show in huge numbers.
Why?
What's going on there?
Well, it's difficult. What makes fish show in one lake could be different to another lake. It may well be to do with the parasite burden, the oxygen content, the time of the year. In my experience, fish showing changes through the year. So they might show at dawn and at some part, in one part of the year, and then it might be 2:00 in the morning. So I feel that shifts about. And obviously, not having been to Gigantica, I've been, but not for a very long time now. Hint, hint, Dan. It would be good to be there and see what they're doing, and also to see a fish on the bank and see it. Has it got a lot of parasites on it? So I would think it's just to do with oxygen content, probably, parasite burdens, and when the fish are becoming active. Showing fish, then they're not always feeding. So there's a showing fish that just pokes his nose out of the water, just like pops his nose up. If a fish is silt feeding, if a carp is feeding in heavy, we've talked about heavy silt already, but if fish are digging about in heavy silt, the gill rakers, that small structure in the gills, the gill rakers point forward, and they're designed to keep the debris off the lamellae, the fine bit that was where the oxygen diffusion takes place. If fish are feeding in heavy silt, those gill rakers get clogged up, and so what they do is they head and shoulder, they top to try and backwash that. So they push their head up and drop back with the gills open. The effect is they push water back up through the gills, it cleans the rakers off, and then they drop back down, and often you'll see a little swirl of bubbles as they're spiralling back down to the bottom to continue feeding. So that's
in deeper water when they're feeding like that. Do they need to show as much?
Well, it depends on the substrate.
Right.
So if you're getting if your gill rakers are getting clogged up with debris, then you'd need to show. So they come up and they show, and there's places.
Do they need to equalise their oxygen levels in their bodies if they're feeding in deeper water?
If it was extremely deep, possibly it might cause.
But like over 20 foot deep.
Yeah, maybe. But the point I'm trying to get to, Simon, is that so if the fish are just pushing their heads out, topping, and they're cleaning their gill ray, because that's not a showing fish. Obviously it's a showing fish. Sorry, that sounds daft. It's a showing fish, but if a fish is crashing out on the surface, that's a different behaviour altogether. And that, in my experience, that's either a very active, very stimulated fish, and often it's a scratchy, itchy response. So fish that are carrying a burden of parasites, very common in carp. A big carp, he's going to have a few argless parasites. It might have a leech or two on it, particularly at this time of year. And so what they'll do to knock those parasites off is either flank on the bottom or rub on clay, and then often they'll thrash themselves out on the surface. So that big sort of thumping out of the water and slapping back down on the surface, they're not doing that because it's fun. They're like, yeehaw, this is wicked. They're doing it because that impacting on the water is going to dislodge parasites that are irritating them. Now, if you've got, let's say, a bit of sunburn, you don't think about it all the time. You go through a period of 24 hours when you think, that's really itchy at the moment, and then it settles back down again. It's the same with the fish. With those parasites are not constantly on it, irritating it. They're on the fish all the time, but there'll be periods in its consciousness when it's really active and really busy and engaged, and it's going about its life.
Can you look at carp and recognise when they're doing that?
Yeah, you can see that in the water. If you watch fish in clear water, you'll see the pecks going. You'll often see the dorsal fin. I'm doing a little flicking with my fingers now, but if you watch a carp in the margins in the summer, you'll often see its dorsal like that. It's not just going, look at my dorsal. That's a parasite response. It's flicking its dorsal because it's got an itch. There'll be an arglus at the bottom of one of its fin rays biting into the skin, and it's doing that because it'll irritate it.
Right.
And often, if you watch that fish, it'll swim around in a circle, and then it'll roll onto its back or side and flank on the bottom. It's trying to knock that parasite off.
Talking about the arglus as well, we'll quickly mention as well about clay. Because
there's a bit of clay.
There's a bit of a misconception, possibly about clay and what the carp actually need it for.
Yeah, I think we're talking sort of loosely here, carp holes, and I know we've spoken a bit about holes at the bottom. In my experience, I've heard some guys I hold in huge high esteem, and very, very experienced anglers who've caught far more than I, that say that carp rub on clay because of the nutrients in the clay. They're trying to get that in that skin. In my experience as a carp farmer and someone who's kept carp since the age of 10, so they'll be about 40 odd years now, they do not need to do that to get nutrients in through the skin. That rubbing on clay is a response to parasite burdens, and it's highlighted over and over and over and over again at the farm. The one spot they like a certain type of clay in particular, and that's the tackiest clay. And if they find a seam of tacky clay in any of our production ponds, they will work that seam of clay all the way along. And the ponds that are the most worked on those seams of clay are always the ponds that the fish have got the most parasites on them. And if you look at the structure of an arglus, it's like a little frisbee, and it's sitting on the flank of a fish like that. That's a very small little parasite. It's sucking itself onto the fish. It's hanging on for dear life because it doesn't want to get knocked off. If that parasite loses hold of the fish, it's over.
Is it?
Yeah. I don't want to lose its host. So they like, if they don't, most arglers never find a host and perish in a lightly stocked fishery. So, once you find your fish, you want to hang on it. So they're on that fish and they're hanging on for dear life. They are then pushing a proboscis into the skin of the fish to feed on it. That is going to irritate you. If you're a fish, that is annoying. It's itchy. And the way to get that off, that parasite is a very fine little creature. If you can smother that with clagging clay, that means it can't breathe, it's in a world of bother. Particularly if you then swim to the top and crash down on the sides, knock it off. So I'm 100% certain the reason that they do that, they like that clay is to flank on. And we see it at the farm, during periods of heavy parasite burdens. Obviously through the year you get periods of high parasites and low parasites. During periods of high parasites, you'll see fish flanking over and over and over again on the clay. And that ties up with the fish having a lot of arglus on them, or leeches.
How long can they swim around with arglus on them for?
Life.
Forever?
Yeah. Most carp in most fisheries in the UK will have some arglus. And I say good.
Right.
Because if they had no arglus, they never show, and they never crash out. And in my experience, fish populations that have got very, very few parasites on them, and I can think of a couple of places I fish where you go some to find a single arglus, those fish never ever crash. Yeah, I can think of a couple of places, some quite big lakes with big fish in them, But if you catch a fish, they might have 30 arglis on them, and those are the places where the fish crash routinely every single day and in the winter.
So those ones that haven't got arglis on, they've just been lucky?
Yeah, they're in lucky. I can think of one lake in particular where I remember we used to go netting when I was a student, a lecturer at Sparsholt. We'd net this lake, and these fish were the cleanest fish I'd ever seen. So they'd obviously gone into the lake clean. The lake was the farmer had dug a new lake, and he had only bought carp from one supplier, and obviously they'd come in with no parasites on them. And we used to do some dissections on those fish. When they spawned, we had little baby carp, and we'd take some home back to the college to do dissections and do some parasitology training with the students. And they were the most clean fish you'd ever. They were like spotless. Every one. You'd never find a parasite. You'd look in the eyeball for eye flukes. You'd look in the gut for carwear. You'd look on the skin for various protozoans and skin flukes. Nothing. No arglis, no fish leeches. They were immaculate. But I know from having fished that lake and friends that have fished it, those fish never ever show. They never need to. So it's quite an interesting one.
Yeah,
so.
It's interesting. Should we get onto your own fishing, Simon?
Uh-oh. Here we go. Yeah, I thought we were sooner or later.
We've never talked about Wraysbury before on the podcast, actually, which...
oh, my word.
We're about 12 podcasts in and we haven't mentioned Wraysbury.
Oh, lucky position to be in.
Yeah, you caught Mary, didn't you?
I did catch Mary, yeah, 52 pounds.
What year was that?
I think it would be 99.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I remember the moment very well.
Yeah, I bet you do. So it would have been cool to have fished. I mean, Wraysbury's got so much history as well. It's a very old lake, isn't it?
Just the very mention of it now, it just makes the hair on the back of my neck stand out. That was, for me, within my own fishing, that was just like the moment, really. It was the pinnacle. It was like arriving at those rusty old gates and looking out across that patch of grass and seeing the South Lake, reaching away in front of me. It was like being at the foothills of Everest. You're thinking, how on earth do we achieve this? To stand there with two fishing rods and think, I'm going to try and catch a carp out of the North Sea. It felt like you were so inadequately prepared for the job. And I had a bit of a build-up. I'd fished Berfield as a prelude to going to Wraysbury. Having read Dave Lane's book, there was a colour plate in there of Mary's Mate and then Malins, and those two plates, those two photographs were amazing. But the one particularly I loved was Malins, and I thought I'd love to go and try and catch that fish. And I thought, but I don't want to go straight to Wraysbury because I kind of had a feeling that Wraysbury was going to be the pinnacle. And so I thought, well, I need to train myself. So I went to Berfield and caught a few fish there. That was a long time ago now, and about 24 years ago. And anyway, so I had a season on Berfield and caught the several fish, in particular the mirror that I wanted to catch, that I'd seen a photograph of. So I caught that one. And then the next year it was time to go to Wraysbury. And I remember going to Wraysbury and just walking across the car park, the Douglas Lane car park, and looking out at that sheet of water and just thinking, where do you start? It was just insane. And at that point, I think there were 44 fish in the lake, 120 acres of water, various depths between 2 foot and 25 feet, snags, weed beds, islands, you name it, the ultimate carp lake. And I mean, it's still a fabulous carp lake now, but it's changed. Nothing stays the same. But Wraysbury, for me, in my own personal journey of fishing, is that lake at that point. 44 fish, Mary, Malins, Cluster, the Pug, Mary's Mate, those sorts of fish. They still.
I think it is for a lot of people, Wraysbury. Mary's Mate, was that about the oldest one in there?
Yeah, it was an old fish.
Yeah, really old. So 1950s, 60s, that kind of era.
Right, it was a very old fish. I remember the first time I saw that fish on the bank, Jim Shelley caught it. I'd made a bit of a mistake the day before, that I'd got lured into the pub. So I'd ended up in the pub and in the Perseverance. And I'd had a couple of pints. And in fact, if I remember rightly, I think I'd been there with possibly Steve Alcott and Jim, and as well as a couple of others. And I was probably, because having come through the carp fishing at that period of the Rob Malin's books, The Famous Five, and that sort of period, Tiger Bay, Fox Pool, obviously Steve Alcott was something of a hero. And so when we sort of got the chance to go to the pub, I was like, oh yeah, definitely. So my first memory of Jim Shelley catching Mary's Mate from Wraysbury was dark red. So what had happened was I'd gone to the pub, and I'd got back from the pub, and I'd gone into my my Woolworth sleeping bag the wrong way round. I was head first inside a red sleeping bag, and I remember hearing this sound drifting across the lake, and I'm lying there thinking, oh my God, I'm dying. I'm dying. And the whole world was bright red, dark bright red, and boiling hot. And I tried to move, and I couldn't move because I was upside down. I was the wrong way round in the sleeping bag, so my head was where my feet should have been. Mary, this sound echoing around the world. I was thinking, what's going on? So I wriggled, and I eventually pulled myself out of my sleeping bag. My eyes were absolutely on fire. The sun was blazing down. I was boiling hot, pouring sweat, had the most severe headache. And about 20 yards away from me were these two bivvies, and one was Nigel Stock and the other one was John Holt. And I walked down to them and slightly sheepishly went, oh, hi guys. What's happened? Oh, Jim's had Mary's mate. You're going to come round and see us? Like, yeah. Thinking, I'm dying. And we walked into the swim, and Jim's getting out Mary's mate out onto the unhooking mat. And I remember thinking, I'm going to have to fish here now until I catch that carp. It's just revealed this enormous, beautiful carp with these huge scales and just colossal length. And I remember thinking, oh my, even with the worst hangover in the world and being very dehydrated and cooked in a red sleeping bag, I was very carpy, the red sleeping bag, by the way. I was looking at this fish thinking, that is just a biblical carp. I thought, I have to catch that one. So, what a carp.
Did you catch that one?
I did, twice, yeah.
Well done, Simon.
Thank you. Yeah.
So after Mary's, because there were a few fish that went in, it's all a little bit unclear, like a lot of these lakes. The fish seem to come in at different periods. Was it stocked? So the Yovany fish? Yeah,
that was the original batch. So that would be measles and Mary's May, I believe. My memory of this
and Olive as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, Olive was in that group. When I did a slideshow which was called the Wraysbury Experience, which sort of documented the lake, the stock, and then my own fishing to catch Malins, because that was the last one of the the big uns that I caught. I knew the dates absolutely inside out then, and all the stockings and all the batches of fish. I'm not so good on it now. Should have given me a little bit of notice. I'd have read my notes. But the Yovany fish were like the first batch that went in.
And then you had another stocking in mid-80s, wasn't it?
Yeah.
With Mary.
Yeah, with the Rainer's fish. So that was if I remember rightly, Mary, Malins, cluster, possibly pug. Yeah. So those few that went in, and they went in as sort of, I think Mary may have been 23 if my memory serves me right. And I remember seeing a Chris Bull video with him going, hi, I'm in the Finger Bays at Wraysbury, and here's one, it's a 20-pounder. And it was Malins, and then he goes, and now I've had another one, and it was cluster, and they were like 22, 23 pounders, but absolute mirror images of what they became when they were 40 pounders.
But those fish were nowhere near as old as some of the other fish in the lake, and they went on to become.
That environment, Wraysbury, the environment there was clearly suited carp. Absolutely, the natural food was just insane. It was just full of food, and the water quality was brilliant, obviously. And you put those two together, and you grow monsters. I
remember the brace. Who was it? Dave.
Cumstone.
Yeah. You know, I mean, what an awesome picture that was. It just inspired
awesome leaves
everybody.
On the floor. Yeah,
brilliant.
Those big sycamore leaves on the grass around him. Yeah, and for me, there was the shot of Pete Springate with his brace as well. Just So when I went to Wraysbury, I just thought, imagine. I just couldn't quite believe I was there. And my first session. I walked round. I stashed my gear as best I was advised that was the thing to do. So I stashed my gear and went walking about, and I'd seen on the forecast the wind, and I'd guesstimating where it might be, and I set up eventually on an area in the North Lake called Springgates Point, and obviously we might talk bait, I guess, in a bit, but I had some Pescaviva sweet corn with me, and that's all I had, one can. So I catapulted some out off the side of Springgates Point, and I cast out my two small running leads and my little nylon hook link setups out that area, and I settled down, and obviously nothing happened. And the next morning I woke up at 5 and I climbed up this tree, which gave me a really good view. and I was looking out at the lake. I thought, right, I'm going to just watch until I fall asleep in the tree and drop out. And so I literally did that, and I watched and I watched and I watched, and the wind was hacking into Springgates Point, and I saw absolutely nothing. That's not quite true, because I watched a bloke pushing his barrow opposite me down the side of the lake, the length of the North Lake, and he set up opposite me, and this was a serious angler. I could see he had all the kit. I mean, I looked at my gear on the floor beneath me and thought, you truly are despicable, Scott. You look like a tramp has gone fishing. And I look opposite, and this guy's clearly got all the kit, and then he thrashes out marker floats, and he's casting and spodding, and I thought, this is a serious angler. I'm up against it here. Anyway, just do what you normally do, Scotty. So I settled down. Eventually, I got so tired, I climbed down out my tree and thought, right, I'm going to have a bit of a sleep. Going to rest for a couple of hours, and then I'll reel in and go looking. I lay on my sleeping bag. I leapt up. I thought, my God. About 20 yards off the side of Springgates Point, a fish showed. And I thought, no way. And then another one. And I couldn't quite believe my eyes. And then another one. And a couple of them were proper big fish as well. But there were some stocky commons there, which at the time were about 20 pounds. And I thought, well, listen, I'm fishing at Wraysbury. I'm happy. I'm a carp angler. I'm happy to catch any carp that come along. I don't care if they're stockies, pasties, pork pies, or Mary. Whatever swims my way, I'm happy to take it. About an hour later, and I thought, well, I'm using sweet corn. I've heard stories of Springgates Point and the tench. I thought, this is going to be a tench. Now, I've forgotten in my excitement that I had turned the sensitivity of the buzzer down as far as it could possibly go. So I casually strolled to the rod to be faced with a spool that's absolutely spinning, and the buzzer's going beep, 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 and it's going around like a proper churner. So I picked the rod up, and it flat rods me, and I think, oh my God, that's definitely not a tench. So I play this fish in, and obviously shaking knees, hands all over the place. I get quite excited about carp fishing. I still do. I'm playing this fish and thinking, oh my God, I'm at Wraysbury, I've got one on, don't fall off, please don't fall off, please don't. I stop talking away to the fish, and eventually it goes in the landing net, and I get it out, and I weigh it, and it's a 20-pound common. And this voice booms across the lake, what a carp, mate! And it's, I went, shh. Come on, carp! How big? This voice bellows back at me. 20 pound! I'll just take a drink now. I've got a harsh voice saying that.
Let's take a lot out of your side, doesn't it, that?
And, anyway, it was a stocky common, 20 pounder. I was absolutely cock-a-hoot, but it was Ian Chilcott opposite me. Obviously, a big character in carp fishing. Got to have a massive amount of respect for everything he's done and his enthusiasm for it, and how he's managed to get out and go fishing through adversity. And I was thinking, oh my God, I've got a superhero carp fishing opposite me. I'm at Wraysbury, and I only got a caught one. So I caught that one, and I rung my mate Ben Gratwick and said, Ben, you won't believe it, I've got one. And we talked it through, and I took myself takes and put the fish back, and it was all done. I was sitting there. Anyway, the next morning it all gone quiet, so I reeled in and I went for a walkabout, and I ended up fishing in a swim called White Fence, which I don't think had been fished for a very, very long time. Anyway, I had only got a little inflatable dinghy at that point, so I was very undergunned, but I got myself organised, got my baits out, and Ben rings me the next morning. It was quite a significant morning for me, and he says, how's it going? I went, not seen anything, absolutely nothing. And I've got Ben on the phone when I get a bite, and I dropped the phone like you would, and I grabbed the rod, and I'm thinking, and I could hear Ben on the speaker in the grass behind me going, what is it? What have you got on? I'm going, I think it's a carp. Anyway, eventually I land this fish, and it was measles, one of the old Yovney fish, at 28.12. And again, falling for the sweet corn trick. So I'm thinking, oh God, I've done 2 nights at Wraysbury and I've caught 2. Anyway, that was the end of that trip. So yeah, that was my start, and it was because I'd had a bit of success, I guess. Suddenly, I knew I could catch carp. I'd been to lots of places and caught them, but your self-belief when you go on a big lake like that, it's just eroded very quickly. You start to doubt. You could have caught a million monsters, But I'm not. I know, like someone like Daryl, who just seems to be able to walk on a place and go, right, smash them. I walk onto a place, and if it doesn't happen quick, my confidence starts to it just niggles around the edges, and you start to question the rig, the hook, the bait. And I'm sat there at Wraysbury. That's how I felt initially. I thought this is too much, but anyway, caught a couple. And once you've caught a couple, you're up and running.
Well, you've got a plan then, haven't you? So
my plan was they eat sweet corn.
Right.
And I'd walked around and I'd seen a few other guys, and I thought, no one else appears to be using. I'm sure there were guys. And listen, I'm not going to claim to be. It's not rocket science. I hadn't set the world on fire. But as I saw it, no one seemed to be using sweet corn. And I had a little incident in the back of the swimming pool bay with a very big brown male carp called Malins in that first couple of weeks. I'd passed Chili, who was fishing then, as I walked round. And I was walking around, and in my little rucksack, I had a can of Pesca Viva sweet corn. I went down in amongst the snags in the swimming pool, and I saw a carp, and I opened my can of corn, and I put the whole handful in, a whole handful, not the whole can. And this huge fish swam round, and it just literally dived on it. And I remember thinking, oh my God, they really eat sweet corn. And Malins was twisting and turning beneath me in 3 or 4 foot of crystal clear Wraysbury water, absolutely ripping the bottom up. I put the whole can in over about an hour, and it had every single grain of this tutti frutti Pesca Viva sweet corn. So catching a couple and seeing that, total belief then.
Sorry, getting back to the corn and the quantity, does it take them very long to get through a can of sweet corn?
It depends on the temperature, but in my experience, they can get through a can of corn very quickly.
You would think so.
Yeah. But there's a bit of volume there. If you think of a can of corn, there's a bit to... Yeah, I work in multiples of 7. 7's my lucky number, so everything's done in 7s. So when I was fishing, I still do this now, which is very sad, but I tend to... It'll be 7 cans of corn, 7 grains of corn, 14 grains of corn, 14 cans of corn. Same with boilies, same with kilos of Vitalin, whatever I'm using. Same with buckets of particle. Still 7s. And yeah, they 7 cans of corn, maybe on the right day, but yeah, often 7 grains of corn will catch you a 50.
It's not like a boilie, is it, where it starts breaking down and you've got residue from the bait. I mean, it's a solid bait, and once it's gone, isn't it?
It's very true. Yeah, definitely. But I think that one thing that it became very clear at Wraysbury very quickly was there weren't any small fish. There weren't nuisance fish. There were tench, clearly, but they were hard. Talking to the tench anglers there, they'd say, "Oh, I haven't had a bite for 2 weeks." So they were quite patchy in their distribution. So I suddenly thought, and I'd had some really good results with corn elsewhere on tricky lakes, and suddenly seeing Malins eating a can, catching a couple, no tench, no bream. Nothing particularly to worry about. I suddenly thought, this is looking good. And
did you use boilies after that, or did you carry on using corn?
I used corn through my first summer on there.
Right.
Yeah, I had Mary on sweet corn, tutti frutti sweet corn, 21 grains of corn. It was the bait, that was the baited pattern. 21 grains of corn, counted individually and put out.
How did you catch Mary?
So I was, I think it was my 3rd or 4th trip, and I'd done my lap round. I stashed my gear in the bushes. I must say, the stash in the gear in the bushes will seem a little strange to people that are not familiar. But that area of close to Heathrow, there's quite a lot of unsavoury characters in that area. Let's put it like that. And fishing kit around Wraysbury had a habit of disappearing, like on an industrial scale. So I lost a full set of gear on one occasion and half a set of gear on another occasion. My mate Ben, I think, lost 3 full sets of gear. So your car would be smashed into.
Were they hiding in the bushes waiting?
No, I don't think they were hiding. They were just driving around going, there's a carp angler, I have all his kit.
And once they know, that's it, I
suppose. And they clock you. They were notoriously tricky there.
It sounded like part of the obstacle of fishing that place.
But once you learned to deal with it, and it obviously gave it a bit of an atmosphere, and if people were around, you made you twitchy. But once you knew about, particularly once I had a hard bottom boat and I could keep my gear in the boat, then I would put my rods out, and then rather than put them on the bank, I'd leave them in the margins underwater. So I'd end up with, you were allowed to use 4 rods at Wraysbury, but more often than not, I'd have 3 rods beneath the surface, laid in the water, and only when I got all 3 rods out would I get them out and put them on buzzers and my kit. But going back to Mary, I'd done my lap round, having stashed my gear, and I was in the car park, in the Douglas Lane car park, in a swim which was called the Route Nightmare, a very famous swim. It produced a lot of big fish. And I sat in the Route Nightmare with Mark Tolland, Cockle, who a really nice guy. I love Cockle, but it's a smashing character. Huge character of carp fishing. Not about so much now, but great character. And I was chatting to Cockle, and we're looking out at the lake, and Cockle was just leaving, and he said, "You want another cup of tea?" And I went, "Yeah, I had another cup of tea." And we're looking out at Wraysbury, and literally 60 yards out, a fish just comes out and just goes, "Badoosh." And he looked at me and went, "That'll do then." And I looked at him and went, yeah, that'll do. I thought, that's cool. So we drank our tea, and while we're drinking our tea, another one showed. And so Cockle said, "Well, good luck, I'll leave you to it." So I set off, I put my life jacket, I blew up my little inflatable dinghy, which is smaller than this table. It was tiny, like a rubber ring. And it wasn't like a cool Sevlor, it wasn't green or anything like that. It was bright blue and yellow. And I set off across Wraysbury with my life jacket. I'm paddling away with my little paddles, and in between my legs I had a little bucket of marker floats, so film canisters with leads. So I paddled out to 60 odd yards where I'd seen the fish and just tried to hold position, and there was a wind blowing from left to right, southwesterly, and there was lovely conditions, overcast, and it was perfect fishing weather. And while I'm out there, this huge fish came up 20 yards from the boat, literally back into the waves. I was like, "Oh, am I?" And I remember my heart pounding. And I literally paddled to the spot, and I just put a marker float straight down on the spot, clip the cork, drop the lead down, and then put it on the cork and set it in position so it's sitting there just bobbing in the ripple. And in fact, it was a film canister I'm holding.
Yeah, I was looking at that.
Yeah, I'm holding this one up now. For those not watching, it's old-fashioned little black film canister. So what I'd do, I'd have a cork inside this, and round the cork would be nylon, 25 foot of nylon, and have a 3-ounce lead. So I'd drop that to the bottom, close the lid to trap the nylon, and then that would just sit there and it would just bob on the waves, and it would be perfect as a market float. Yeah. Handy and discreet. Very true. And so I ended up with about 6 of these dotted around the area. So what I'd sort of, as I'd seen fish show, I'd drop these things close to where they showed. What I then did is I went back to the bank and I picked up a rod with a lead and I went donking. So I didn't have an echo sound or anything technological like that. So I went out and I went to the first marker float, and I just back-wound, as I drifted past it, I just back-wound my lead down, and it went thump and lifted it, and went thump, lifted it, thump and lifted it, and then I thought, weed. So I paddled back upwind again and did the same routine. And after about an hour of doing this, I realised that there was a sort of a landing strip of clear with weed banks either side of it. And I thought, well, that's perfect. So I kept it really simple. All I did was I'd move my floats about a tiny bit so they were sort of lined up on this clear strip on the bottom. So I had a float at either end and one in the middle. And all I did with my rods was paddle upwind and then back wound the lead down so it went bump on that clear landing strip. And I'd bring it back up again and just practice it again. Bump, third time. Boom, right, that's set perfect. Take the rod back to the bank, lay it in the margins, did the second one the same, third one the same. So that's the rods in with 3 or 4 little grains of corn on each one. Then I paddled back out and I got 21 grains of Pescaviva corn in my hand, and I literally went flick 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 18, 19, 20, 21.
Spread it around a little bit?
Yeah, spread it around, yeah. Paddled back to the bank, got set up, got everything, house up. Wind's blowing. I looked like a tramp anyway. This was causing me chaos, so now my brolly's fallen over on its side, and I couldn't get the pegs in the ground and anything. That was all my problems. Got my bob, and the wind is blowing, and the weed is collecting on the line, so the rod's going deet 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 deet. Anyway, about 1 o'clock, beep beep, flyer. So I play this fish, and it gets weeded up, and I'll be honest, I'm a long time past being on the lake, and I'm never going to need that ticket again. So it weeded me up quite badly, so I had to slip into my boat in the night, put my life jacket on, went out and got above it. Sorry for breaking the rules. And I got above the fish, and I'm playing this fish, and I'm thinking, it feels like a good, and it was fighting quite hard. I got it up, eventually get it in the landing net, and it was another common. I'm thinking, they really do like sweet corn, because as far as I could establish, there was hardly any stockies getting caught at that point, and I'd had 2 of them now, and measles. Got the fish sorted, went back out, repositioned the rod exactly in the dark. Now I had sight lines on the tree, so I knew where my landing strip was, so I knew it went boom, perfect. So I got that back out there, got set up, got back to bed, got back in my sleeping bag. 2 o'clock, another one note on the same rod. Absolute flyer. This fish fought and fought and fought, and it's tearing up and down. I'm thinking, nobody catches 3 stocky commons it's just this would be 2 in a night, but I was thinking I've already had one, so this will be my 3rd stocky and measles. I'm thinking this can't be enough. It's going to be a big one. And I'm playing this fish, and I don't know why, but I had in my head it was Mary's mate because it was really fighting hard. But of course, I was thinking about pictures of what Wraysbury fish it could be, and anyway, eventually I slide the net under this common, £20. Oh, I can't believe it. And then I paddle back to the bank. I think, 2 £20 commons. This is unreal. I've had 3 £20 commons now and measles. Come on. No one's caught 3. So I go out, put the rod back out, get back into my sleeping bag. And that's that. I wake up at first light and I trot down the bank quickly and I give Jim Shelley, who's in the next swim, the Mad Dog swim, a shout and say, Jim, I've got a couple of stockies. Could you help me with the photos? He goes, oh, Boise. I won't take Jim off. I can't do it well. But he says, nobody catches. You are the pest control officer. So he christened me the pest control officer. I was thinking, well, I'm happy with that because as far as I'm concerned, if they're little fish, they're a big fish. So we're sat there it was a horrible morning and we're sat in I took some quick pictures of the stocky commons, the pests, as Jim called them. And he's going, the pest control officer. Does the pest control officer want a cup of tea? And I said, yeah. So we sat in Jim's car, and I remember where I sat. I sat in his passenger seat. He was sat in the driving seat on the left, and I'm sat on the right. No, I got that the wrong way around. I must have been sat the other side. I was sat on the left. He was sat on the right. And I had the window slightly ajar, and I could see my rods. They were only 20 yards in front of me. And we're drinking a cup of tea, and he's got the windscreen wipers on, and the engine's running because it was cold, and we were both damp. And we're looking out across Wraysbury and not seeing a fish show. And I just remember the moment so clearly. I get emotional every time I tell this story. The middle bobbin lifted, pulled up tight, and there was a single bleep. And then absolutely all hell let loose. It's just absolute dee, and this bit of weed tented up, and it just stayed on the line, and the middle rod has just gone flat down to the water. I run down, and Jim says, I'll get the bow, and I went, be another common. He goes, nobody ever catches 3 stocky commons in a night. So I'm holding the rod, I'm playing this fish, and it's just taken line and taken line and taken line, and I'm thinking, this one's really pulling very, very hard. And it takes Jim. Now, Jim is, those of you that know Jim Shelley well, and I say he handled the situation brilliantly, but he isn't Linford Christie. He ran back to his swim. He got his hard bottom boat because I said, I'll go out in the dinghy. He went, no, it's too rough. You're going to need a hard bottom boat. And he paddled back with his boat up along the bank. He said, get in. And while I'm getting into the boat, it's still taking line. I'm thinking, this is just pulled and pulled and pulled and pulled. Anyway, we get out there. And I get above the spot where obviously the back of the clear strip where I'd hooked it from, and the rod hoops over, and I'm grind, pull, and the rod's bent over, and and Jim says, "What pound hook link you got?" I went, £12 big, £12 big game straight off the reel. I cut it off and tied the rigs before I set up. He went, £12 line. He said, "Yeah," but I said it'll be fine. It'll be fine because I've got a size 6 Drunnen Continental boiler. Going to be fine, Jim. Don't worry about that. The line will be fine. It's just if. And he goes, "Oh my God, you're fishing at Wraysbury with a £12 hook link." Anyway, I've got the rod's bent over, and there's those are people that have been out in a boat and had a fish, and we will know this feeling all too well. There's that lovely sensation. It's sort of solid, and then there's just a little rocking motion, and you can feel the fish's fins moving, and then the rod just gives a little nod as the fish kicks, and that lovely moment when the tip starts to pull back down to the water, and you think, still on there. And that went on and on, and it went through weed bed after weed bed after weed bed. And at some time during the journey, the fish had done a full 90-degree turn and gone left, and my lead was running on the line, didn't have a clip or anything, so I had a ball lead on, 3 or 4 ounce ball lead, and that ran off down the line, and we turned direction. We went sort of left a bit up in the wind, and Jim's paddling away. Now Jim is stood in the back of the boat with the paddles with his Polaroids on, doing like the Jim look, and I'm crouching at the front, and I just had an old raincoat on. I had shorts on. The rain was coming down. It was windy. I couldn't see anything. I was just playing the fish. And this huge tail came out on the surface at one point during the fight, and it just thrashed across the surface. Now Jim stood behind me. I went, "Don't tell me. Just keep the boat solid. Don't tell me what it is. Just keep the boat solid. Keep the boat solid, Jim. Don't want to know. Let's just play the fish." And that moment, that whole shopping list of monsters in that lake runs through your head, because you're thinking, Malins, tail's the wrong colour. Are you thinking about Dave Lane's book? Tail's the wrong colour, wrong shaped tail. Cluster, wrong colour on the back of the fish. It's not cluster. It's not the right colour of the fish. The fish is the wrong colour. The pug, no, it's definitely not the pug. It's the wrong colour. It's definitely not Jacko's common. It's not a common. It's definitely a mirror. And you go down that list and you think, M, A, R, oh no, it's Mary, please don't come on, And this fish at that point, it was like having a dog on a lead. It just powered off beneath the boat, and I remember thinking, oh no. And my rod's bent over again, and it absolutely weeded me up solid again, and I'm thinking, no, please don't come off. And anyway, fight goes on, it went on, it just seemed to go on forever. And eventually, this huge ball of weed came up, and Jim Trot leapt over me, scooped it up in the net, and I just collapsed in the back of the boat. As you can tell from my voice now, the emotion at that moment was just completely off the scale of my fishing. And I sat back in the back of the boat and I went, is it Mary? He went, of course it's bloody Mary. Why the fish would fight like that, for Christ's sake, man? It's Mary every day of the week. What did you think it was? I'm like, Stocky Common, get out of here. And we paddled back. Anyway.
Do you think he knew straight away on the bite?
I think he knew pretty early on, but he never said a word, bless him, man. Yeah, without a doubt, during the fight, he knew exactly what it was. And I knew from the tail when it come up. But there's that moment of, it just can't be happening. When you start carp fishing, you tell from my emotions.
Yeah, I know,
raw.
it's great. I love this.
But at the time, when you start carp fishing, I know as a young kid, you're fishing little lakes and you dream of catching the big one in the lake. All of a sudden, you're catching the biggest carp in the country. And that takes some getting your head round. And when I get it back to the bank and you're there and it's like laid out on the mat, you just think, oh, that's the biggest mirror carp in the country. I've caught the biggest mirror carp in the country. I've caught the biggest mirror carp in the country. This is the current British record carp, and I've caught it. I've caught it on 3 grains of sweet corn, over 21 grains of sweet corn, on a size 6 hook and 12-pound line. Jim, bless him, said we did the photos, and it's still the whole thing still seems insane. We did the pictures, let the fish go, and I did fish on for another hour or two, and then I said, Jim, can we go and buy some beer? So we went out and I bought breakfast for Jim, and we had breakfast together in the cafe with a couple of others, and then I drunk myself through an entire slab of beer and I think I rung everybody in my address book on my phone until it was dead, and it was just insane. And I remember telling my girlfriend at the time, I said, I've caught Mary. She wasn't the first person I rung, I had. And she said, does that mean you're coming home now? I went, oh no. No, I definitely couldn't drive home. Anyway, and the next day she said, you're coming home now? I said, no, because there's several more to catch. So yeah, and bizarrely, that was my first fish over 40 pounds. I'd had a 39.12, and then I jumped the 40s and I had a 52.
52 pounds. That was a great story.
What a carp.
You told that very, very well.
I'm sorry for the over emotion.
No, it's great.
Yeah, as an angler, and anybody listening to this has carp fished a long time, hopefully you will understand.
I'm sure they will. So moving on from that, so did you find a blueprint in your mind for catching those fish? What was in your mind the most effective way of catching fish on there? Or did these fish, were they territorial? Did they tend to stick around in certain places?
I think carp that's one of the things about carp, and because they look different, you can identify individuals. It's one of the reasons we all love them so much. And that you do learn that individual fish have individual routines and patterns in their lives. So you'll get resident fish. I mentioned measles. That fish used to love the finger bays. Dave Lane referred to it as the finger bays mirror. That fish spent a lot of time living in the finger bays area of the lake. I think I caught measles 5 or 6 times in the end. Wow. Because when I was fishing for the pug, which got into living in the railway lake, which was beside the finger bay. So measles and I bumped into each other. I caught measles a fair few times. In the end, it was a bit like...
But she didn't like you after a while.
No, we fell out. No, I did catch on a few other baits, because sweet corn, it definitely blew sweet corn for me.
Did it? Did you think so?
Yeah, they definitely. Well, they were spooking off after within 18 months. Definitely.
Just due to one angler?
No. Somebody else called Mark Tolland Cockle was also using three corn, and he used it devastatingly well as well. So that it became less effective. And then my fishing, my second year, I caught quite a lot of fish. My first year, I think I had 10 fish the first year. The second year, I struggled like mad. I lost my mum, and I just couldn't find my mojo really. And I did catch a cluster that year, and then my third, fourth and fifth year it just got better and better and better really. The fourth year I caught a lot, and the fifth year was I was so, by that point I had learnt the lake very well. I knew the patterns of the fish. I was just looking for Malins, the last 40 pounder. So I caught the pug twice at once at 39 and once at 40. I caught Mary's mate twice over 40, cluster at 40, Mary at 52, and I was just fishing for Malins. I remember my mate Ben said to me at the end of the fourth season, "Wow, you've just had a biblical season. Do you carry on?" And he was like, "No." I said, I came here to catch Malins, and I'm not leaving this lake until I've caught the carp or it's dead. So which is a dangerous road to go down, that obsessional pursuit of one individual fish. I vowed never to get back into that after Malins. But that one fish, I knew I could catch it. I just hadn't been in the right place at the right time. And it had been caught, and it was, occasionally it'd get caught and then disappear for a few months, but I'd see it so much. But I'd learned by that fifth season, I knew I'd lost it. I did lose it quite early on. I stalked it and lost it. Which was a difficult 24 hours.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, I managed to get on its case, and I followed it round, and about the third or fourth morning I stalked it, got the trap set perfect, hooked the fish, and then I fell in, and my rod got caught in the trees, and anyway, snapped me up, gone. But I'm quite glad I did lose it, because I think if I'd landed it then, I might not have gone on to catch all the others. But by the end of my fourth season, I'd caught the full set apart from Malins, and Ben said, "You're going back?" And I went, "Yeah, definitely." And I started baiting. Colin Davison had formulated a bait which he called Red October, and he said, "Look, I'm happy to give you as much as you need." And I thought, right, okay. Well, if I've learned anything from carp fishing, I've learned that you don't need to fish with a lot of bait, but if you pre-bait with a lot of bait, it can do you a big favour. So Colin was good to his word, and I picked up a lot of boilies from the factory. And I started putting them in the close season. Now, at that point, Ben was also baiting up with me because we were going to use the same bait. And fortunately for me, at about the start of the season, Ben bumped into a very, very attractive blonde lady. And that, for Ben, was pretty much the end of his season. I look back now, thought it all fell rather nicely into place for me, because Ben had done a lot of the hard work, and then the two terrorists in his underpants got the better of him. I could understand she was a pretty girl, but for me, it basically opened the door to just right, the baiting's done. And my fifth season, I did catch a lot of fish, and it went really well. And so I caught the pug that they were just tearing the bait up. And it was in September time. Finally, the story came to an end. That I had baited the week before a stick off the Route Nightmare swim that's laid in about 18 foot of water, not far away from a clear strip that I'd caught a big fish a couple of years previously. And this stick laid on the bottom, I'd baited it along one side with my bait dropper. Because one of the things at Wraysbury, that possibly I mentioned the boats, but on there at that point you could use boats and glass bottom buckets. So you could find someone's individual boilie on the bottom if you knew where to look. So you had to be a little bit sly with your tactics. And we haven't got time now to go into some of the tactics, but there was a lot of hiding bait under shells, like this swan mussel shell. I'd learnt a trick about putting swan mussel shells over spots, because if you look over the side of a boat with Polaroids on, you can't see a swan mussel shell that's that way up, but you can that way up. So, and of course a fish feeds anywhere near that, it flips. So I used to leave these on the spots, for example, and then you'd be able to go over and you'd see when they were that way up, you just see the fish had been there. You wouldn't have to use your glass bottom bucket. So the moment you sat on the side of the boat with your glass bottom bucket and look down, you go, he's got a spot there. So you could, if you could avoid the look making it obvious. It was a good tactic.
Yeah, that's clever.
Anyway,
yeah,
there's many more. But I looked at this little stick and I'd baited it with crumb along the side of it. And I looked down, I'd spent the day looking for fish and for spots and checking spots, and nothing looked particularly good. And it was going towards the end of the day, and I looked at this little twig and it had turned and it was in a different orientation. And I thought, it wasn't like that last week. It was pointing straight out from the swim, and now it's running left to right. I thought somebody's had a little feed down there, and it's been just pushed along. It's only a small stick, so just pushed it along with his nose or her nose. So I thought, right, that'll do. So I put a rod either side of the stick, literally just a few crumbed up boilies. And in the early hours of the morning, I had a bite. Another titanic boat battle in the dark. Got the fish in the landing net, which I'd done, I think, 37 times up to that point in 5 years at Wraysbury. Got it in the landing net, clicked the head torch on, and I'm looking at this huge ball of weed, and at the top of the back of the ball of weed, there's this tail, and the top lobe of the tail, a little white fleck in it. It was like, oh my God, wow. Fancy finding you. And that was it, £42. So that was the last one of my Wraysbury set.
God, potentially you could have been on there for years, couldn't you? Waiting to catch that one.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'd really, the crosshairs were on that fit. I don't know what I'd done if I hadn't caught it that year. It's really interesting, actually. That year, it had damaged its eye during spawning. And I remember seeing its right eye, hanging out of the socket, really badly damaged. And I remember thinking, oh no, that looks awful. What have you done? And obviously the fish had powered off into the distance. I thought, that looks, but I was thinking it's definitely Malins. I thought, oh no, the fish I most desperately wanted out of that whole lot, I'm not ever going to catch it. And then I remember one of the other guys on the lake saying, have you seen Malins? His eye looks awful. And I had, and I thought, yeah, it doesn't look good. But when I caught it, it was in immaculate condition. It's really interesting. There's a little caveat to the story. The following spring, in my garden pond, one of my koi, a fish I used to call maggot on account of the fact it was sort of bright, reddy orange thing, it had an accident when it was spawning. It was a male fish and used to get incredibly carried away during spawning, but who can blame it, because it only ever bred once a year. And it had collided with the rockery and it smashed its eye. And when I put it back in the pond, its eye swelled right out and looked like it was going to lose its eye. It was hanging right out of its skull, and I thought, it's going to lose its eye. And it was really interesting because obviously in the confines of a garden pond I could observe what happened. Within 2 weeks it was completely healed. So obviously carp have got a really good ability to rebuild, fix their eyes after damage.
And you think it regained its eyesight? I mean, even though it looked like it had healed.
Yeah, well, when I caught Malins, obviously I was fascinated to look at the eyes, and both eyes were, and you can see in the pictures, they were absolutely perfect, not a mark.
No,
you'd never know that. It must have run into a stick and given itself a proper jab. And then
that was it, yeah.
Anyway, job done.
But you had left a bit of a legacy on there as well, didn't you? Not just with what you caught, but stocking fish into the lake as well. Yeah, I put some fish in there, yeah. So while I was at Sparsholt, I chatted to Ian Welsh and Viv Shears. And Viv at that point, who obviously becomes my partner at VS Fisheries, was working for Leisure Sport Angling with Ian Welsh. And I spoke to Steve Alcott, and we agreed that maybe Wraysbury could have a few new fish. And so I showed some photographs to Steve Alcott, and I selected some fish, and that was very much in my embryonic days of carp farming, and they probably weren't the best fish I've ever groomed, but looking at them now, I look at them and think, oh, that one had a bad mouth, I shouldn't have put that one in. But anyway, yeah, I'd selected these fish, and I tank reared them, which was a bit of a mistake, because the one thing you learn is if, certainly young fish, they need to be out feeding as substrate into sediment to get the correct formation of the skull. Anyway, these fish were tank reared, and I grew them up to about 14 to 18 pounds, I guess, maybe 11 to 18 pounds, something like that. And we stocked those fish into, and there were only 10 of them, and they went into Wraysbury to become the Scotty Stockies. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And I've got photos of some of them from literally like this in my hand, little tiny sort of 6 to 10 inch fish, right through to mid 40s, definitely. And I've had a few, some highlights have been ex-students ringing me in the early hours. I remember one particular student ringing me in the early hours. Sorry to ring you at 2:30 in the morning. And Sue's lying beside me going, who is that? Okay. It's just an ex-student. I've got like one of, I've got sea scale or lucky or one of the fish. And, that's a great thing to think that I spawned that fish, grew it, stocked it, and now it's gone on to become a bigger and better thing. Obviously, then Viv and I took the business on, and now we're doing it on a much bigger scale.
Yeah, but a mighty lake for those fish that were reared in fish tanks to end up going into.
An amazing place. Yeah, an amazing place. And subsequently, when RK Leisure took on Wraysbury and made their changes, and obviously made it a different fishery, but they bought a lot of fish from us, which are fantastic, and it's great to see those fish now doing well in that environment. And funny enough, I saw a photo yesterday on Instagram of one of VS Fisheries fish that have come out. So
excellent.
Yeah, so they're still they're doing well. So it's nice to think that we've left a few out there.
Yeah. So getting on to another lake that I know you're fishing at the moment, Berfield.
Yep.
And
I fished that before Wraysbury.
Yeah, you mentioned that. Yeah. So obviously, it was a nice excuse to get back and fish Berfield, maybe more exclusively.
Yeah. So after Wraysbury, I think I've spoken to others that have fished at Wraysbury in that period. And I talk about the pinnacle or the Everest of your fishing. It's very difficult to go somewhere after fishing a place like that where you've had great success. You have really, really put your whole soul into it. The emotional roller coaster of losing your tackle and then getting it sorted and getting back up there again to catch those fish is a those were as I grew up in carp fishing, those were the fish I read about. Those were the pinnacle fish, and to have caught such a big number of them, those Mary's Mate 40, Malins 40, the Pug over 40, Cluster over 40, and Mary 52.
It's a nice photo album.
That's a serious set of fish to have caught, and such history iconic fish. I'd had a little soiree to the Carp Park Lake, and I'm very lucky that I caught Chunky and Pearly Tail there, but I just found. You felt like you were being. It was like being in a glass aquarium there. Everyone was watching everybody all the time, and it was just a bit too. I like a bit of space when I'm fishing. I'd fished Berfield previously, and that was always in the back of my mind. I went to Cote Water and caught the longfish there a couple of times, and I fished a few other places, but I was struggling to find my mojo. I fished lots of places, but I found it difficult. But then you gravitated back towards Berfield because those fish at Berfield, when I first fished there, there was a fish called cuttail, which was the big one, and I'd caught that. And that fish had been a scraper 40. When I caught it, it was 33 pound. It spawned out. The Berfield common at that point was a low 30. And I know it got caught that year when I was there the first time round, but it wasn't on my sort of radar. I wasn't there. I wanted to catch cuttail. That was the fish I'd seen, and I was very lucky that in my first few weeks on Berfield, I'd found them, and it's a different place now. Then I fished Alsatian Bay. I was in there one day, and I'd seen a fish. And to put a sort of time of the year on it, it was during Wimbledon, and Tim Henman was at Wimbledon playing. So it was a few years ago. He's past playing now, and I remember seeing the weed hit the surface in Alsatian Bay, and I started baiting a spot in there, and I caught pretty much from the off, and they just literally, absolutely obliterated this spot. And it's funny, there's threads that run through my fishing, but I was using Vitalin by the industrial bucket load, and they had literally dug a crater twice the size of this table we sat around into the sediment in the bottom of Alsatian. I was fishing in a silt, and they dug a huge crater, and I remember thinking, this is looking good. And my first,
sorry, how did you know there was a crater there?
Because I was breaking another rule. I should say I'd cast out my marker float, but at that point it was a very lawless place, and that you never saw. I fished 1 week in there once in Alsatian Bay, never saw another human in a week. So I'd gone out in my little tiny dinghy, had paddled out there, and I'd put a marker float down. Again, it was a little cork job, and dropped some bait on it. And anyway, over a few days, this hole opened up. And the first time I fished it, I put I cast 2 rods in the hole. It was only short range, it wasn't long. Cast out, and they went thump, thump. I thought, this is good. Put some bait out, and the next morning there was a fizzer on my spot. And I'm thinking, this looks good. And then one crashed out on my spot, and what I'd done, a bit of an inexperience, I'd put too much bait in while I was fishing, and I watched for a good few hours while they were tearing up my spot. And what I had to do, because the bream were problematic, I was using quite high pop-ups to try and slow the bream down. I just didn't get a bite, and just after dark I had my first bite, and that was pinch belly. And I'm playing it on a size, I don't know what I was doing really. I was playing it, I had a size 10 hook, size 10
we've all
hook
done that.
in weedy water and £10 nylon hook link. And so I'd find down to try and buy a bite, and I got a bite, and I'm playing it, and it went bonkers. And we'll get it in, and it was pinch belly. And then the next fish I had was 3 up, 5 down. Then I had a common, which I think turns out that common at the time, it was only about £18, but it fought like a train. And I had to take to my dinghy during the fight, and it towed me right out of the bay, right out into the middle of Berfield. That fish, I'm as confident as I possibly can be from a very poor quality image I got from back then. But that was that fish went on to become the fish that we now call, I'm going to forget the name of it. Oh my God, what's it called? Not the big common, not the patch common. Give me a moment. It'll come back in a second.
Yeah, come back.
Too many commons.
Yeah.
But the saddleback common. So yeah, sorry, the saddleback common. So I get this that one, and then anyway, somewhere along the line, I'm walking around, and I'm in Alsatian Bay again. There's this massive fizz on my spot, and I thought, oh, that's good. This looks good. I climbed a tree, and there's another fizz on my spot, and then the fizz moved away, but it looked like it was just one fish. So it fizzed. A huge fizz, and then it would move 20 yards and then fizz under the weed. Anyway, I thought, well, I'll fish on my spot. So I put my 2 rigs back on the spot, and about 10 o'clock, it must have been earlier than that, maybe 9:30 in the evening, I had a bite, and I play this fish in, and I get it in the land, and it's cuttail. And I remember I sacked the fish up, not knowing better, and at that point it predates mobile phones. So I then walked to the Cunning Man, and I rung my mate Ben Gratwick. Now I rung it. Of course, he still lived with his mum and stepdad. And I ring up, and Mrs. Gratwick answers the phone. This is probably it was past closing. I literally got in on last orders, and she said, "I don't want to drink. I just want to use the phone." And the landlord was like, "Oh God, yeah, whatever." And so I rang it, and Mrs. Gratwick answers the phone. She goes, "Hello," a very concerned mother voice. I went, "Oh, hi, Carol, it's just Simon. It's nothing serious. Is Ben awake?" And she went, "Well, of course he's not awake, Simon. It's 11 o'clock at night." I went, "Could you go and wake him up, please?" And she went, "Really?" I said, "Yes, I've caught a big one." She went, "Oh, you boys, you're all the same." Anyway, she puts the phone down and she trots off to go. And then a couple of moments later, I get the geese. I went, I've caught cuttail. And he went, "Well, I'll be up tomorrow." And he said, "I'll be up at lunchtime." I said, "Can you get up any early?" "Can't." I said, "I can't, I've got to work." So I did self-takes of that one on my own.
Did you?
That was a bit of a hairy moment.
Yeah,
I was thinking, I don't want to ruin it this time. But yeah, so I did self-takes. And then off to Wraysbury and Coatwater and a few others. And then, so I've gravitated back to Berfield.
Berfield's, it's always evolving, that lake, isn't it? In terms of where you can fish on the lake and the stocks of fish that are in there now. So those original fish, are many of those still knocking around?
There are very few of those original fish. The classic, which is a mirror, is still about, I believe. So there's 1 or 2 of those fish, but they were old fish. I think they were stocked in 1954, and my understanding was that they were held in cages in the lake. So before they were stocked, I'm not sure what the reasoning was, but they were held in these pens in the lake. And the upshot of that is a lot of the fish got caught up in the cages. Now, anybody that's done any holding carp in cages will know that the serrated first ray of the dorsal is quite hooked, and it gets caught in the cage. Oh. And a lot of those original fish had quite damaged fins, or the first ray or the anal fin would be a bit damaged, and cuttail, surprise, surprise, had a damaged tail. So those original fish were quite old. They were quite old the first time I went round. So,
really old.
Yeah, so they would be very old. But Berfield was stocked. There's obviously a few stockings occurred, odds and ends appeared from different places, and there's quite a significant stocking of fish that came out of the blue pool. So when Leisure Sport stocked the blue pool, and Ian Welsh was developing it as a runs water, I remember walking past the blue pool way back the first time at Berfield and seeing all these little high singles sneaking around in the snags and stuff, and they were a bit of a distraction, because when you're walking around Berfield trying to find 30 or 40 carp in 100 odd acres full of islands and
That's
snags,
a better option.
You suddenly walk past these little high singles and low doubles and think, "Oh, you look like a bit of fun." But some of those fish got into the big lake, and of course they've become now really, really big fish in their own right.
So they weren't stocked. They were.
To my understanding, that during some floods, some got in.
Right. So do we know how many are in there?
I'm not sure how many originally got in. They were a bit of a pain initially, I think, because obviously guys that were fishing for the big originals, they would appear en masse, and they were doubles and sort of 20s. But there's a few. I think the stock of Berfield's definitely gone down now. When I fished it on and off quite a bit, so I often get muddled up as to the timings I was there. But that first time I was there, those original fish, there was only sort of 20 or 30. Then there's this hit of fish come from the blue pool. Probably going back 10 or 12 years, I had a bit of a flurry on there again, and there were quite a lot of fish there, and I reckon maybe as many as 200. I would say now there could be 175 to 125.
It seems like the lake's completely changed, because it went from being a water that one particular fish that everybody wants to catch on there to being just a big fish water in general. Yeah, with a lot of 40-pound fish in there. Those
blue pool fish have become really big fish now. Yeah, and I like I don't know. I like catching. The last I caught a common out of Berfield not so long ago, a little one, and it was 20 pounds, and I reckon I caught that fish in 1996 the first time, and I reckon it was 100 years old then. And I caught it again. I promise it's the same fish, and it hasn't changed at all. It looks identical. The weight is the same, and I think I was happy to catch that. So I like catching them all. But there are now some serious carp in there. Yeah, some of those blue pool fish became 50-pounders. Without doubt, that seam of water around Reading. Just look at the number of absolute massive fish that have come off the back of that in that area. Big uns all over.
Pingewood, and what's the other lake behind that? The
Field Lagoon.
Over the motorway. Yeah. Pingewood. What's the other lake?
Farnham Flint's got monsters in it. Englefield's got monsters in it. The Causeway. There's
Sonning as well.
Sonning. So in that seam of water, there are some huge fish, and you put a fish in that environment, they just seem to completely flourish. The natural food's obviously right, the chemistry, the water's right, and they do very, very well.
Interesting. But that lake, it offers a fair few obstacles as well, doesn't it?
Oh yeah,
it's just as hard.
The bank is very, very broken up. You're very limited on where you can fish. There's big areas out of bounds. I'm extraordinarily lucky that just through a little chain of events happened to be in the right place at the right time, and that has given me a little bit of okay, guys that are listening, a humongous privilege. I'm very lucky to fish a little bit that I can fish. But yeah, it's a difficult place to fish.
Daryl mentioned on the podcast that being able to fish unfished areas of the lake has made a real difference on that. Have you found that as well? And why is that? Are they just sitting in these out of bounds areas for that long? Or
they do. And wherever the fishing pressure is, if I fish the bit that I've fished lately in the last couple of years, they move out of that. I always think of carp populations, they respond to pressure, and wherever you apply that pressure, it's like a bit of a sort of elastic ball. They just push off in another direction, and so they end up sitting in a long, big area right out in the middle. A guy that I hold in huge esteem once said to me, the thing about Berfield is you just don't want to fish further than 60 yards because that fish is an absolute animal. Now, I've pushed it out to 100 yards, to be honest. I've tried a bit further, but I'm never happy fishing. I'd rather you want to start that fight with the upper hand. If I can catch it 5 feet from the bank, I'll be hook it 5 feet from the bank. At least that's given you 100 yards of start. That first run gets that out of the way before it hits the trouble.
Does it always fight like that fish?
Well, I don't know. The impression I get is it does, but then if you look at the spot where Terry caught it from, you think, how could it brilliant, obviously a brilliant angler, brilliant set of situations. He read it perfectly and hooked the fish, and he stopped it and it didn't get into trouble. But I think if I'd hooked Mary where Terry caught the Berfield common, Mary would have actually been halfway across Reading by the time I'd stopped her. So I don't know. I think I've caught fish before that people say, oh, that one fights very hard, and you think, well, it didn't fight that hard when I caught it. Conversely, I've had fish fight like absolute maniacs, and then I've told people about this fish and they go, oh no, I had that one, it didn't fight at all when I had it. So sometimes, I think it's catching them on the right day, time of year.
You found it in the margins a bit, haven't you, that one? Berfield Common?
Yeah,
we got a picture of it.
Yeah, I believe
we have.
Yeah,
Can you put that
second.
up there, Tobe, just to look at?
Yeah,
to see that one.
This doesn't sit easily watching these pictures. Do we have to watch this? It's like it's not a video.
It's enticing you, Simon.
Yeah, no, I feel bad now. This is a moment. Yeah,
Yeah.
This was a very, very intense 48 hours.
Have you got it just there, Tobe?
There it is.
Big fish in the water. Yeah, that's the Berfield Common.
It's pretty unmistakable, that one, isn't it?
I was fairly close in as well.
Yeah.
So it makes me feel even worse to know that I had a little stack of sweet corn about 10 feet away from it there.
Was she interested?
Yeah, she come and had a little play. We had a little close encounter that day. But yeah, I was up a tree. I went into it was interesting. It was in the back bays, and which is a really intense area of the lake. And I'd done a full lap and not seen a fish, but of course they're really nomadic in there. It's a big lake. It's very broken up, and I had I'd done a lap round, not seen anything, and I was back in that area. I was on the edge of Weedy Bay, and I saw a fish on the surface cruising, and it was one of those carp when it's cruising. It was like, I am definitely going somewhere. I know exactly where I'm going, and that's the direction I'm heading in. And it was taking this very direct route, and it was going towards the back bays. So I got ahead of it, and I watched it pass a couple of the points as it come past, and I thought, you know exactly where you're going. This is not random motion. I've touched on this a bit already. So I went a bit further down in the bay, and as I got there, I saw another fish, and then I thought, you're just coming to see your mates, that you know exactly where they are. And I went round the corner, and I got into this tiny little bit at the back of the dogleg, and the sun was shining, the water was crystal clear, and I just looked up and went, there's the Berfield Common. And it was just sat 10 yards in front of me. I mean, it's like looking at a dolphin in an aquarium. It was, yeah, there it is. There's just absolutely no.
How catchable do you think they are in that state when they're
That one was not catchable. I managed to get it taking floating crust in there. I had a moment where it was under some bits of shrubby bushes, willow, and it was coming up under the tree and taking the crust that went in the tree. And as it come up, the whole branch would lift as this huge shape came up underneath it. Again, think dolphin taking a ball, lifting a ball on its nose. As it come up through the branches, the whole tree would lift and then go back down as the bread would go and disappear in front of me. And I couldn't get the hook on the bread, and I put a strong line now, bigger hook, big bit of bread, and I got it a bit damp, and I'd flick it, and the bread would go one way, the hook would end up in the tree, and I was like, no, it's not happening. It's not happening. But yeah, anyway,
Yeah, I wonder.
after a couple of days, it melted away, and that back to walking and looking. But yeah,
We're talking about the lake, and I know that you've got some catches that you're going to mention at a later date. But are there surprises in Berfield?
yeah, I think any lake like that where you're very limited onto where you can go and where you can fish. Carp are fantastic at learning. They learn very, very quickly, and they become, and they're creatures of habit. So they'll learn about an area is safe, or they'll learn a way of life or a routine that's safe to them, and then they follow that, and they get into a bit of a routine. And now, on a place like Berfield, and also at Wraysbury, you'll get fish that are living a lifestyle that has made them become very difficult to catch, or they're in an area that makes them very difficult to catch. And I think at Wraysbury, particularly there's a fish there, a very famous fish called the king of the fungus mirrors. Now, when I fished there, that fish had only been caught once, and it had been caught at 14 pounds. And I remember people saying to me, Simon, this king of the fungus mirrors, is it real? Is it really there? Because obviously there were myths and legends bubbling about. And you go, yeah. And they go, well, how do you know? And I say, because I can go out in my hard bottom boat, and I could take you, and I could show you that fish from 5 feet away in bright sunshine on an afternoon in August, and it's lying there in the weed like the Titanic, and you can see this massive black scar on its left-hand flank. You could almost put your thumb in that mark before it spook off. There's no question that fish is living in that lake, but it didn't get caught from 14 pounds to 36 pounds. And the guy that caught it on that catcher, he did something just right, and it slipped up. And and then it got caught a bit more. It did get caught a bit after that, but again, it disappears for long periods. And I think, isn't that the wonderful thing about carp fishing, that you can have all the internet information, all the material you can buy, all the books, everything you can read, all the videos you can watch. But they are wild creatures, and they're not all 100% predictable, and some just disappear. And I love
You
that.
said in other circumstances as well, you've been out on boats looking around and a fish has turned up that you haven't seen for 20 years and you're able to use the boat and be able to...
Yeah, I mean, not at Berfield, but I caught a carp a couple of years ago. That fish hadn't been caught for 22 years, and that's in a lake that gets fished a fair bit, and it turns out that was its third ever capture. And the last time it had been caught, if I've got my statistics right, it was caught by a guy called Ian Russell, who at that point, a very famous angler, lovely guy, he had loads of hair. So that puts a time scale on it, because as far as I can never remember Ian Russell ever having any hair at all. And yeah, so I just love the fact that...
that's a complete surprise.
Yeah, I
I
spoke to a couple of guys and they thought that fish had been dead a long time. So I love that. That's one of the... Surely that's one of the best things about carp fishing, is that they can just vanish and then reappear and be a big surprise. That's a fantastic thing.
Getting back onto Berfield, with the... is the pressure on there quite high at the moment? A lot of anglers fishing
there's
it?
a lot of guys. So I'm very lucky that I have an area that I have pretty much to myself. But yeah, the rest of the guys that are fishing the syndicate, there's only a certain limited number of swims, and the fish tend to sit in one or two areas that makes them very difficult to reach.
They can use bait boats on there.
They can, yeah. But any fish out of Berfield, when anybody, if someone catches a fish out of Berfield, I can be more chuffed with them. It's just they are very, very special fish.
Yeah, no, it's a different way of catching fish.
And your fish, you're climbing a mega mountain there to catch. The thing about that Berfield corner, obviously Darryl has spoken about it, but that fish, not only is it truly massive, but in all of my meetings with it's just like a slightly quirky creature, that one. It just doesn't quite fit the mould. It's like a slightly different species of carp that just thinks, reacts, behaves just slightly outside the box to the norm. And I know when Dave Lane called it, and I have a massive respect for Dave, and I love his writings and his books. And I've touched on his book already. I mean, I hung on his every word when I was a youngster getting into this sport. But he called it just lots of fish, big hit, bait, and called it. But 9 times out of 10, in my experience, watching that fish, it just behaves slightly different. It's like the kid in the school playground that doesn't quite want to play football, doesn't quite fit in. But that kid's also 6'6" tall,
Yeah. I mean, are you fishing specifically for that fish, or are you just fishing the lake?
I fished the lake. When I was at Wraysbury for that lot, no, I'm lying. No, I'm not lying. When I fished at Wraysbury that last season, I absolutely 100% that was the one to catch. I've got to be honest now that when I fish at Berfield, I'm just happy to catch any carp that come along. It's all fun, and as I said earlier, I'm a junkie to that buzzer. Just seeing it pull up tight and the rod rip off is just brilliant. And yeah, I mean, obviously, if ever I was lucky enough to catch that fish, I would be cock a hoop. But just catching, they're big fish, aren't they?
There's so many big fish in there now.
I still think a 30-pounder is a gigantic carp. I mean, the day that I catch a 30-pounder and get flippant and just go, oh, it's just a 30, then please, will someone shoot me? Because that is when the whole essence...
I keep looking at that skull there. It keeps winking at me.
I'll turn it round.
30-pound carp,
yeah. Poor old fish. And he's saying, you're never going to catch me.
That's a big fish, though, Simon.
Yeah, it is. And I hope I never, ever lose that. I'd still look, when I look in the landing net and I've got a 30-pounder, I still think... that just looks absolutely massive, and I think it's easy in the world today of YouTube and Instagram. If you're a young guy and you're a carp fisherman, looking on Instagram, there's just so many images of absolutely huge fish. It's easy to think, oh, what's the point? I'm never going to catch. If you catch the biggest fish in your lake, or you're catching the group that is, or a bigger, and if it's a 20-pounder for you or a 15-pounder, it shouldn't matter. It's the fun of going and catching the fish. I absolutely bloody love just catching carp, if I'm honest. And when it rattles off, yeah, I'm as excited now, and I could tell you 10 stories. I don't know how much time we've got, but 10 stories of chaos and carnage that happen in my swim when I'm far too overexcited playing a carp. And if I lose one in the dead of night now, I still punish myself for weeks and weeks and weeks about the stupid thing that I did, or I pulled too hard, or the hook pulled, or whatever.
Yeah, it's keeping it real.
Yeah, and long may I keep that feeling. That's what makes. Yeah, I love it. I absolutely flipping love it, and long may it last. And I'll say, if the day that I catch a 30 and just let it go out the net, please just someone walk along, just blast one straight through my head.
No, it's that enthusiasm that gets people listening to this and
Yeah.
makes people want to get out and go fishing in the first place. Crikey, it's gone fast, this. 3 hours odd nearly.
Oh, we've got-
one more question.
Oh, no.
One more question for you.
Oh, no.
So I've left
Oh,
the best
no.
question till last. So your secret fishing edge, Simon.
Oh, my word.
We want to know a secret fishing edge that you've got that you haven't told anybody else before.
Well, apart from get a swim that no one else can fish, it's just for the guys at Berfield. Sorry. I think it's very difficult, because if I give you my very best secret edges, I would say I'm a great believer in, if someone says to you, the spot here, mate, is 20 wraps, never fish 20 wraps. That would
Right.
be my secret edge. I absolutely go out of my way now to avoid fishing spots that other people fish,
Okay.
like to an extreme, I think. And I often find, to just couple onto that because I think the carp farming and seeing ponds with no water in, I'm a great believer in, I find the softest, muddiest, blackest, horriblest clay areas, silty areas. I'll fish those all day long rather than the clear gravel patches.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a good bit of advice.
So those two.
Yeah.
If you're don't get too. If you're going on a lake and someone says to you, the spot here, mate, is 20 wraps that way, put one at 20 wraps. But if I were you, I'd put one in the edge under the tree on the
discard
right.
anywhere else.
And and try and go different, because going back to what I learned with the farm and keeping carp in tanks and ponds all my life, nearest damn it, they learn so bloody quickly. Just their ability to learn through behaviour is so rapid that if they've been caught over and over and over and over on that spot at 20 wraps, 19 wraps might get you 10 more bites, or 21 wraps.
Great
In my
advice.
case, 19 wraps, because I can't cast 20.
No, that's good. Want to hear about that Berfield story one day as well. I look forward to that one coming
One more
out.
bite, and I promise.
One more bite. Yeah, okay.
Sometime never.
So it's been great. Thank you very much.
No, my pleasure.
Simon Scott, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
No worries.
The Thinking Tackle podcast.